In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But once, just once, in 10,000 years of stagnation and decay, the Imperium of man remembered what it meant to truly conquer. When the 41st millennium was still young and the galaxy trembled before Imperial might, long before the current age of desperate survival consumed all hope of expansion, a single man emerged from the noble houses of Mordian, who would achieve what none had accomplished since the Emperor himself walked among mortals. His name was Macharius, Lord Solar Macharius, and in 7 blood-soaked years he would conquer 1,000 worlds, pushing the boundaries of the Imperium further than any force had dared since the Great Crusade itself. The Macharian Crusade stands as the last great victory of humanity, a campaign so vast and successful that it rivaled the legendary conquests of the Primarchs. 7 entire Space Marine chapters marched under his banner. 30 Titan legions shook worlds with their thunderous advance. 1,000 regiments of the Imperial Guard followed him into the void, each one burning with fanatical devotion to their Lord Solar. The Imperial Navy assembled the largest battle fleet seen since Horus turned traitor, their ships blackening the stars as they carved a path of conquest through the galaxy's rim. Yet for all its glory, for all its unprecedented success, the Macharian Crusade would end not in triumph, but in betrayal, madness, and civil war. The very forces that had conquered 1,000 worlds would turn their weapons upon each other, and the man who had achieved the impossible would die alone, poisoned by those he trusted most, his dreams of eternal expansion crumbling into ash and bitter memory. But that ending, that terrible conclusion that would scar the Imperium for millennia to come, was still years away when young Macharius first gazed upon the stars and dared to dream of conquest beyond the galaxy's edge. The fragments of knowledge that survive in the archives of Terra paint a picture of a being who achieved mastery over the art of war when the Imperium had forgotten how to truly wage it. Born into the rigid military nobility of Mordian, Macharius emerged during an epoch when the Imperium's greatest ambition was merely to survive another day. The galaxy of Medad 41 contained perhaps 10,000 times more threats than it had during the Great Crusade. Yet the Imperial response had become cautious, defensive, reactive rather than the bold expansion that had once claimed the stars for humanity. Archaeological evidence and fragmentary records place the beginning of Macharius's rise somewhere between M41.3, 90 and M41.3, 90 and M41.3, 92, during the aftermath of the Age of Apostasy, when the Imperium was still reeling from Goj Vandiya's reign of terror. Where other commanders saw only the need to rebuild and consolidate, Macharius perceived opportunity. Where others feared overextension and disaster, he envisioned glory beyond measure. The initial reports from his early campaigns on Mordian's frontier speak of tactical innovations that would revolutionize Imperial Guard doctrine. Combined arms warfare on a scale not seen since the Primarchs led their legions. Lightning strikes followed by rapid consolidation that left enemy forces reeling and broken. But more than tactical brilliance, the records speak of something else entirely. They describe a commander who inspired absolute loyalty, fanatical devotion, and unwavering faith in the righteousness of Imperial conquest. Those who served under Macharius in those early years would later claim they witnessed something approaching the divine. Guardsmen spoke of feeling the Emperor's own presence when their Lord Solar addressed them. Space Marines, those post-human warriors who kneel to no mortal authority, bent the knee before his strategic genius. Even the proud tech priests of Mars acknowledged his understanding of the machine god's will, made manifest in warfare. Yet even in those early victories, there were signs that this crusade would be different from any that had come before. Reports filtered back to Terra of discoveries made on the frontier world's ancient ruins bearing warnings in languages that predated human civilization. Xenos artifacts that spoke of civilizations fleeing not toward the galaxy's center, but away from it, as if something in the void beyond the rim had driven them to seek shelter among the stars. Macharius collected these artifacts, studied them with an intensity that concerned his closest advisors. When asked about his findings, he would speak only of humanity's manifest destiny to claim dominion over all creation. But those who knew him best noticed changes. The confident young commander began to display an obsession with the galaxy's edge, with the darkness that lay beyond known space. He commissioned star charts that pushed far past Imperial borders, requisitioned deep void scanning equipment designed for exploration rather than conquest. The truth about what drove Macharius to demand permission for the largest crusade in Imperial history would only become clear much later, when it was far too late to stop the catastrophe that was already set in motion. For now, in these early days of glory and triumph, few questioned the motives of a man who delivered victory after victory against the enemies of mankind. But had they known what Macharius had already discovered in those ancient ruins, had they understood the true nature of what awaited at the galaxy's rim, perhaps they would have realized that some victories come at a price too terrible to contemplate. Perhaps they would have understood that the man who would become the last great conqueror of humanity was not seeking glory or territory, but something far more desperate and infinitely more dangerous. The Macharian crusade was about to begin, and with it would come revelations that would shake the very foundations of what it meant to be human in a galaxy that held secrets older and more terrifying than even the Imperium's darkest nightmares. The galaxy into which Macharius was born bore little resemblance to the realm of endless possibility that had greeted the Emperor's Great Crusade 10 millennia earlier. By mere 41.395, the Imperium of man had settled into patterns of grim survival that its architects would have found unrecognizable. The age of expansion had given way to an age of consolidation, then to an age of mere endurance. What had once been humanity's birthright among the stars had become a desperate struggle to maintain what remained of a crumbling empire. The Segmentum Solar, that heartland of imperial power surrounding ancient Terra, still bore the scars of the age of apostasy that had ended barely 3 centuries before Macharius's birth. Gojivandur's reign of terror had left institutions shattered, trust broken, and a deep-seated paranoia about ambitious individuals who might rise too high, too quickly. The High Lords of Terra had restructured the Imperium's military command to prevent any single individual from accumulating the kind of power that Vanduri had wielded, inadvertently creating a system that actively discouraged the bold leadership that had once conquered the galaxy. Imperial Guard regiments across the Segmentum had grown accustomed to defensive thinking. Their strategic doctrines focused on holding existing territory rather than claiming new worlds. The very concept of launching a crusade on the scale of the ancient legions seemed not just impossible, but actively heretical to many commanders who had internalized the lessons of Vandire's fall. Better to maintain what the Imperium possessed than risk everything on dreams of expansion that had died with the Primarchs. Yet even in this climate of caution and defensive mentality, certain worlds maintained traditions that harkened back to the glory days of Imperial conquest. Mordian was one such world, its Iron Guard regiments renowned throughout the segmentum for their discipline, tactical flexibility, and unwavering loyalty to the Imperial ideal. Where other worlds had embraced the new philosophy of conservative military action, Mordian's officer academies still taught the classical doctrines of aggressive warfare and rapid exploitation of tactical advantages. It was into this environment that Macharius was born, raised among the military nobility that governed Mordian's countless regiments. From his earliest days, he absorbed lessons in combined arms warfare that most Imperial commanders had forgotten. The Mordian academies maintained archives dating back to the Great Crusade itself, technical manuals and strategic treatises that outlined methods of warfare on a galactic scale. While other worlds trained their officers to manage single regiments or at best small battle groups, Mordian's elite learned to think in terms of entire sectors and multi-system campaigns. The young Macharius excelled in these studies with an intensity that bordered on obsession. His instructors reported a student who absorbed tactical knowledge with unprecedented speed, who could visualize complex multi-front operations with a clarity that suggested genuine strategic genius. More importantly, he displayed an intuitive understanding of logistics and supply management that would prove crucial in the years to come. While his peers focused on the glamorous aspects of command, Macharius immersed himself in the mundane but essential mathematics of moving armies across interstellar distances. By Me 41.390, when Macharius received his first independent command, the broader Imperial military had grown complacent in ways that would have horrified the architects of the Great Crusade. Standard operating procedures assumed that enemy forces would be fought on Imperial terms, using familiar tactics and weapons systems that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. The typical Imperial Guard response to xenos incursions involved massive but predictable frontal assaults supported by orbital bombardment, followed by prolonged grinding campaigns designed to wear down enemy resistance through attrition. This doctrine had proven adequate against the familiar threats that plagued the Imperium's borders. Orc raids, chaos cultist uprisings, and minor xenos predations could be handled by the established methods, though often at tremendous cost in Imperial lives and resources. What the Imperial military had not seriously considered was the possibility of encountering enemies that possessed technological advantages or tactical innovations that could neutralize traditional Imperial strengths. Macharius, however, had studied the ancient accounts of Primarch-led campaigns that had encountered and defeated technologically superior foes. He understood that the Great Crusade's success had not come from simple numerical superiority, but from tactical flexibility and the willingness to abandon established doctrine when circumstances demanded innovation. His early campaigns on Mordian's frontier demonstrated this understanding in practice, employing rapid strike tactics and unconventional force compositions that left enemy commanders struggling to respond. The results were spectacular by the standards of the era. Xenos incursions that might have required months of grinding warfare to suppress were eliminated in weeks. Chaos cults that had taken root on multiple worlds were eradicated through coordinated multi-system operations that prevented their escape and regrouping. Most importantly, these victories were achieved with minimal Imperial casualties, a consideration that had become crucial in an era when the Imperium could ill afford to waste human resources on costly campaigns. Word of these successes began to reach Terra, where they attracted attention from elements within the High Lords, who had grown frustrated with the military's defensive mindset. The Imperium faced threats on every front, with xenos incursions becoming more frequent and more sophisticated with each passing year. Traditional defensive strategies were proving inadequate to stem the tide of aggression, and some within the Imperial hierarchy had begun to consider whether more aggressive responses might be necessary. Yet even as Macharius's reputation grew, there were troubling signs that his methods differed from standard Imperial practice in ways that went beyond mere tactical innovation. Intelligence reports from his campaigns mentioned the recovery of xenos artifacts and ancient ruins that Macharius insisted on studying personally rather than destroying according to standing orders. His forces were observed employing non-standard equipment and tactics that suggested influence from non-Imperial sources, though no formal complaints were filed, given the consistent success of his operations. More concerning were reports of changes in Macharius himself during these early campaigns. Officers who had known him since his academy days noted an increasing preoccupation with star charts and deep space reconnaissance that seemed to extend far beyond the immediate tactical requirements of frontier warfare. He commissioned surveys of space beyond Mordian's sector that served no apparent strategic purpose, and his private quarters reportedly contained maps and astronomical data covering regions that lay well outside Imperial space. When questioned about these activities, Macharius spoke of the need to understand the broader strategic picture, to anticipate threats that might emerge from unexplored regions. His explanations were reasonable enough to satisfy immediate superiors, but those closest to him suspected deeper motivations. The young commander, who had once focused entirely on tactical excellence, was developing interests that extended into realms of knowledge that few Imperial officers ever considered. Unknown to his contemporaries, Macharius had begun to encounter evidence that would eventually drive him to propose the most ambitious military campaign since the Great Crusade itself. Ancient ruins discovered on worlds recently reclaimed from xenos occupation contained artifacts and inscriptions that spoke of civilizations far older than humanity's expansion into space. More disturbing still, these ruins consistently showed signs of hasty abandonment, as if their builders had fled from some threat that approached from beyond the galaxy's rim. The pattern was subtle, but unmistakable to someone with Macharius's analytical mind. Worlds that should have been developed as major population centers showed signs of evacuation rather than conquest. Defensive installations faced outward from the galaxy rather than protecting interior territories. Most tellingly, the few intact records that could be decoded spoke not of expansion toward galactic center, but of retreat from something that lay in the void beyond known space. These discoveries would shape Macharius's thinking in ways that would ultimately determine the course of his crusade and the fate of everyone who followed him. But in these early years, As he consolidated his reputation through a series of brilliant tactical victories, few suspected that their rising star harbored ambitions and knowledge that would soon reshape the entire strategic balance of the galaxy. The stage was being set for the greatest military campaign in Imperial history, though none yet realized that its true purpose would be far more desperate and infinitely more dangerous than mere conquest of enemy territory. By MIP 41.391, the name Macharius had begun to echo through the command halls of the Segmentum Solar with a resonance that had not been heard since the days of the Great Crusade. What had begun as a series of brilliant tactical victories on Mordian's frontier had evolved into something far more significant. The young officer who had once commanded a single regiment now controlled entire battle groups, his authority expanding with each successful campaign against the xenos threats that plagued the galaxy's rim. The transformation had not occurred overnight. Macharius understood better than most that rapid promotion without proper foundation breeds resentment and suspicion among established commanders. Instead, he had methodically built his reputation through a careful sequence of increasingly complex operations that demonstrated not just tactical brilliance, but the kind of strategic thinking that the Imperium desperately needed. Each victory served as preparation for larger challenges, each success becoming a stepping stone toward greater authority. His first major breakthrough came during the Helios incident of Meson 41.391, when a previously unknown xenospecies launched coordinated attacks against 17 Imperial worlds simultaneously. The assault caught Imperial forces completely unprepared, their response fragmenting into 17 separate defensive actions that allowed the aliens to maintain initiative across multiple fronts. Traditional Imperial doctrine called for reinforcing each world individually, a strategy that would have required months to implement and would likely have resulted in the loss of at least half the targeted systems. Macharius proposed an alternative that horrified conventional military thinking, but proved devastatingly effective. Rather than dispersing Imperial forces to defend all 17 worlds, he concentrated available battle groups into 3 massive strike forces and abandoned the weakest positions entirely. This apparent retreat allowed the xenos forces to commit fully to their attacks, believing they had achieved decisive advantage. When Macharius launched his counteroffensive, the alien forces found themselves overextended and vulnerable to coordinated assault from unexpected directions. The campaign concluded in just 6 weeks with the complete destruction of the xenos fleet and the recapture of all 17 worlds. More importantly, Macharius had demonstrated an approach to warfare that prioritized strategic mobility over territorial defense, a concept that would later become central to Crusade doctrine. The High Lords took notice, and more importantly, so did the Space Marine chapters, whose cooperation would prove essential for any large-scale campaign. The Salamanders were the first chapter to formally acknowledge Macharius as a worthy commander of combined Imperial forces. Their Captain General, Tushan, had personally observed the Helios campaign and recognized in Macharius something that reminded him of the ancient Primarch commanders. This endorsement carried enormous weight within Astartes circles, where respect for mortal commanders had diminished significantly since the days when the Emperor himself had led humanity to war. Chapter Master Vladimir Pugh of the Steel Confessors became another early supporter, particularly impressed by Macharius's understanding of space marine capabilities and limitations. Unlike many Imperial Guard commanders who viewed Astartes as simply elite infantry to be deployed for the most difficult objectives, Macharius demonstrated sophisticated appreciation for how space marine forces could be integrated into larger strategic frameworks. His battle plans accounted for the unique strengths of power armor assault tactics, while compensating for the relatively small numbers of Marines available for extended campaigns. The Raptor Legion, Black Templars, Vostroyan Firstborn Guard regiments, and eventually even elements of the Iron Hands began requesting assignment to Macharius's operations. Word spread through military channels that serving under the Mordian commander offered opportunities for the kind of decisive warfare that many officers had never experienced. Veterans spoke of campaigns where victory was achieved through superior strategy rather than simple attrition, where Imperial casualties remained minimal while enemy forces faced complete annihilation. Yet even as his reputation grew, those closest to Macharius began to notice disturbing changes in their commander's behavior and priorities. The confident young officer, who had once focused entirely on immediate tactical challenges, was developing obsessions that extended far beyond the scope of normal military planning. His personal quarters accumulated star charts covering regions that lay well outside Imperial space, astronomical data that served no apparent purpose for frontier warfare, and most troubling of all, artifacts recovered from ancient xenos ruins that should have been destroyed according to standard operating procedures. Captain Thalassa of his personal staff, one of the few officers privy to Macharius's private activities, would later report that their commander had begun conducting what he called deep historical analysis of enemy civilizations encountered during his campaigns. This research went far beyond normal intelligence gathering, extending into archaeological investigation of ruins found on liberated worlds. Macharius insisted on personally examining any artifacts or inscriptions discovered by Imperial forces, often spending hours studying materials that appeared to have no military relevance whatsoever. The pattern of these discoveries began to reveal disturbing consistency. Worlds that had been occupied by various xenos species showed evidence of much older civilizations that had apparently fled toward the galactic core rather than expanding outward, as would be expected from successful spacefaring cultures. Defensive installations on these worlds invariably faced away from Imperial space, suggesting that their builders had feared threats approaching from the galaxy's rim rather than from human territory. Most unsettling were the few intact records that Imperial tech priests managed to decode from these ancient sites. The fragments spoke consistently of something called the Dark Beyond, or the Void That Hungers, references that seemed to describe not specific enemy forces, but rather some fundamental threat that existed in the empty space beyond the galaxy's spiral arms. These records suggested that multiple ancient civilizations had encountered whatever lay in that darkness and had chosen flight over confrontation. Macharius compiled this information with methodical precision, cross-referencing archaeological findings with astronomical surveys and deep space reconnaissance reports. His personal archives began to resemble those of an inquisitor more than a military commander, filled with speculation about threats that had never been encountered by Imperial forces. When questioned by his staff about these activities, he spoke of the need to understand the complete strategic picture and the importance of anticipating challenges that might emerge from unexplored regions. The truth, though none yet realized it, was that Macharius had begun to perceive patterns in the ancient evidence that pointed toward a threat so vast and terrible that it dwarfed any enemy the Imperium had previously encountered. The xenos civilizations he had been fighting were not simply aggressive species seeking to expand their territory, but refugees fleeing from something that had driven them from their original homes in the galaxy's outer reaches. Their attacks on Imperial worlds were not acts of conquest, but desperate attempts to claim sanctuary from whatever pursued them from the darkness beyond known space. This realization would eventually drive Macharius to propose the most ambitious military campaign in Imperial history, but in these early years, he kept his growing understanding carefully concealed. Instead, he focused on building the reputation and political capital necessary to gain approval for large-scale operations that would allow him to investigate these threats more thoroughly. Each successful campaign brought him closer to the authority he would need to launch a full-scale exploration of the galaxy's rim. The process required careful cultivation of relationships with key figures throughout the Imperial hierarchy. Macharius understood that even the most brilliant military commander could accomplish nothing without proper political support, and he invested considerable effort in building alliances with influential members of the administratum, the ecclesiarchy, and most crucially, the Space Marine chapters whose participation would be essential for any major crusade. His approach differed significantly from traditional Imperial Guard politics, which typically focused on competition for resources and favorable assignments. Instead, Macharius presented his campaigns as opportunities for collaborative achievement that would benefit all participating organizations. He shared credit generously with allied commanders, ensured that Space Marine chapters received appropriate recognition for their contributions, and maintained scrupulous attention to proper protocol in all dealings with Imperial institutions. By Min 41.392, this patient political cultivation had begun to yield dramatic results. Macharius found himself invited to participate in strategic planning sessions at levels far above his nominal rank, his opinions sought by senior commanders who had decades more experience, but recognized his unique talents. More importantly, he had gained access to intelligence resources and strategic databases that revealed the full scope of threats facing the Imperium across multiple sectors simultaneously. The picture that emerged from this broader perspective confirmed Macharius's worst suspicions about the nature of the challenges confronting humanity. The xenos incursions that he had been combating on Mordian's frontier were part of a much larger pattern of aggression that extended across thousands of light-years of Imperial space. Enemy forces were becoming more sophisticated, more coordinated, and more desperate with each passing year, as if driven by pressures that extended far beyond simple territorial ambition. Traditional Imperial responses were proving increasingly inadequate to address these escalating threats. Defensive strategies that had worked against familiar enemies like orcs and chaos cultists failed completely when confronted with technologically advanced xenos species whose capabilities exceeded Imperial understanding. Worse still, many of these new enemies demonstrated tactical knowledge that suggested extensive study of Imperial military doctrine, as if they had been preparing for confrontation with human forces for far longer than anyone had realized. Macharius began to formulate a radical alternative to the Imperium's defensive posture. Rather than waiting for enemy forces to attack Imperial territory and then responding with costly defensive campaigns, he envisioned massive preemptive strikes that would carry the war into enemy space and eliminate threats before they could fully mobilize. The concept required resources and authority on a scale not seen since the Great Crusade, but Macharius believed that only such overwhelming force could address the true magnitude of what the Imperium faced. The political groundwork for this proposal had been carefully laid through years of successful smaller operations that demonstrated Macharius's ability to achieve decisive results with minimal Imperial casualties. His reputation for tactical innovation and strategic thinking had reached the highest levels of Imperial command, while his personal relationships with Space Marine leadership ensured that any major campaign proposal would receive serious consideration from the Astartes chapters, whose participation would be essential. As Main 41.392 drew to a close, Macharius prepared to present his vision to the High Lords of Terra themselves. He had compiled comprehensive intelligence on xenos threats across multiple sectors, developed detailed operational plans for preemptive campaigns that could eliminate these threats permanently, and secured preliminary support from key military and political figures throughout the Imperium. What he had not yet revealed to anyone was the true scope of his ambitions, or the terrifying knowledge that had convinced him that humanity's survival depended on pushing Imperial forces farther into unknown space than any expedition had dared venture since the Age of Strife. The emergence of Lord Solar Macharius as the most significant military commander of his era was nearly complete, but the greatest challenges still lay ahead. The success of his proposal would require convincing the Imperial hierarchy to abandon 10,000 years of defensive thinking and commit to the largest military campaign in human history. More daunting still, it would require preparing humanity for discoveries that would challenge everything the Imperium believed about its place in the galaxy and the nature of the threats that waited in the darkness beyond known space. The great amphitheater of the Senatorium Imperialis had not witnessed such unanimous approval for a military proposal in over 2 millennia. When Macharius concluded his presentation to the High Lords of Terra on the 15th day of Septembris, Mien 41.392, the silence that followed spoke volumes about the impact of his words. Lord Commander Militant Drakon Vangerich had initially planned to spend months reviewing the proposal for what Macharius termed aggressive pacification campaigns, but the strategic analysis presented that day left little room for debate. The young commander had not simply requested permission to launch another frontier war. Instead, he had presented a comprehensive vision for reshaping the Imperium's entire strategic posture, backed by intelligence data that revealed threats of unprecedented scope and sophistication. The evidence was overwhelming and terrifying in equal measure. Xenos civilizations across dozens of sectors were coordinating their attacks with precision that suggested central planning on a galactic scale. More disturbing still, intercepted communications indicated that these species viewed their conflicts with humanity not as territorial disputes, but as desperate survival struggles against some unspecified greater threat. Lord Admiral Wrath of the Imperial Navy had initially expressed skepticism about committing substantial fleet resources to what appeared to be speculative campaigns beyond established Imperial borders. However, Macharius's presentation included detailed analysis of captured xenos technology that demonstrated capabilities far exceeding anything previously encountered. Enemy weapons systems incorporated scientific principles that Imperial tech priests had classified as theoretical impossibilities. Their vessels employed propulsion methods that allowed faster-than-light travel without relying on warp navigation, suggesting access to knowledge that predated humanity's expansion into space. The implications were staggering. If these xenos species possessed such advanced technology, their relatively limited success against Imperial forces could only be explained by the hypothesis that they were fighting defensive rather than offensive campaigns. They were not seeking to conquer Imperial territory so much as to establish buffer zones against something that threatened them from beyond the galaxy's rim. The ancient archaeological evidence that Macharius had compiled supported this interpretation, painting a picture of multiple civilizations fleeing toward the galactic core over millions of years of evolutionary history. Master of the Administratum Gog, Van Dyer, had been dead for 3 centuries, but his successors remained deeply suspicious of ambitious military commanders who sought resources on unprecedented scales. Yet even the most paranoid bureaucratic minds could not ignore the mathematical projections that Macharius presented. Current defensive strategies were consuming Imperial resources at unsustainable rates, while failing to eliminate the sources of continuous xenos aggression. At the present rate of attrition, the Imperium would be forced to abandon entire sectors within 5 centuries, creating cascading strategic collapse that would ultimately threaten Terra itself. The alternative that Macharius proposed offered hope for breaking this cycle of decline. Rather than waiting for enemy forces to attack Imperial territory and then responding with costly defensive campaigns, he envisioned massive preemptive strikes that would eliminate threats at their source. The concept required unprecedented concentration of Imperial military assets, but the potential rewards justified the enormous investment. Successful implementation could secure the Imperium's borders for millennia, while providing access to xenos technologies that might revolutionize human capabilities across multiple fields of knowledge. Fabricator General Lucas Crome of the Adeptus Mechanicus proved surprisingly supportive of the proposal, particularly after reviewing samples of recovered xenos artifacts that demonstrated engineering principles unknown to Imperial science. The cult Mechanicus had grown increasingly concerned about technological stagnation within the Imperium, as innovation had given way to mere maintenance of existing systems over the past several millennia. Access to advanced xenos technology offered possibilities for renewed progress that had seemed impossible under normal circumstances. The Space Marine chapters present for the briefing expressed unanimous support for Macharius's vision, though their reasons differed significantly from those of the Imperial bureaucracy. Chapter Master Pedro Cantor of the Crimson Fists spoke eloquently about the warrior spirit that had been stifled by centuries of defensive thinking. The Astartes had been created for aggressive warfare against humanity's enemies, not for the grinding attritional campaigns that had become standard Imperial practice. Macharius offered them opportunity to fulfill their true purpose as instruments of conquest rather than mere guardians of existing territory. Captain General Trajan Valoris of the Adeptus Custodes remained notably silent during the proceedings, though his presence alone indicated the level of attention that Macharius's proposal had attracted from the highest levels of Imperial authority. The custodians had access to intelligence sources unavailable to other Imperial organizations, and their willingness to attend the briefing suggested that they possessed information corroborating Macharius's assessments of emerging threats. The formal approval came with unprecedented speed and scope. The High Lords authorized the largest concentration of Imperial military assets since the Horus Heresy, granting Macharius authority over resources that dwarfed anything provided to previous commanders. 7 entire Space Marine chapters volunteered for extended deployment under his command, including the Imperial Fists, Firehawks, Minotaurs, Vostroyan Guard, and 3 chapters whose names remain classified in surviving records. 30 Titan legions committed their god machines to the campaign, while the Imperial Navy assembled a battle fleet of over 12,000 vessels ranging from escort frigates to Gloriana-class battleships. Perhaps most significantly, the Administratum granted Macharius the title of Lord Solar and authority to requisition additional resources from any Imperial world as operational necessities required. This level of autonomous command had not been granted to any individual since the Primarchs themselves had led the Great Crusade. The implications were not lost on anyone present during the authorization ceremony. The Imperium was committing itself to a campaign that could either secure humanity's future among the stars or destroy the greatest military force ever assembled in its name. The initial target selection revealed the sophisticated nature of Macharius's strategic thinking. Rather than launching immediate attacks against the most obvious xenos threats, he chose objectives that would provide maximum intelligence value while demonstrating Imperial capabilities to potential enemies. The first phase of operations focused on systems that had been recently abandoned by their original inhabitants, allowing Imperial forces to study advanced alien technology without facing determined resistance from its creators. The results exceeded even optimistic projections. Imperial archaeotech specialists working under Tech Adept Coriel Zeth discovered xenos installations incorporating scientific principles that revolutionized understanding of multiple technological fields. Gravitational manipulation systems provided insights that led to improvements in Imperial void shield technology. Energy weapon designs offered potential upgrades to lass weapon efficiency that could benefit every Imperial Guard regiment in the galaxy. Most remarkably, navigation computers recovered from abandoned xenos vessels contained star charts covering regions of space that Imperial exploratory missions had never successfully mapped. Yet these discoveries also confirmed Macharius's most disturbing suspicions about the nature of the threats facing the Imperium. The abandoned installations had been evacuated hastily, with valuable equipment left behind and defensive systems still active despite the absence of their operators. The pattern suggested that whoever had built these facilities had fled from some approaching threat rather than being defeated by Imperial forces or local rivals. More ominously, the advanced sensor networks found in several locations had been specifically configured to monitor space beyond the galaxy's rim rather than tracking activity within known stellar regions. Captain Lysander of the Imperial Fists led the first major expedition to investigate these sensor installations, accompanied by elements of the 15th Mordian Iron Guard and a full maniple of Titans from the Legio Gryphonicus. What they discovered would reshape understanding of the strategic situation facing the Imperium and provide the first concrete evidence supporting Macharius's theories about threats from beyond known space. The sensor logs recovered from the primary installation contained records spanning approximately 15,000 years of continuous monitoring. The data revealed systematic movement of massive objects through interstellar space, following trajectories that originated from regions far beyond the galactic rim and proceeded steadily toward areas of known stellar activity. The objects were too large and numerous to be natural phenomena, like asteroids or comets, while their coordinated movement patterns suggested intelligent control rather than random drift through space. More disturbing still, the sensor logs showed that these movements had accelerated dramatically over the past several millennia, with the frequency and size of detected objects increasing exponentially. Whatever intelligence controlled these movements had become more active precisely during the period when xenos aggression against Imperial territory had intensified. The correlation was too strong to be coincidental, suggesting that the various species attacking human worlds were responding to pressures from the same source that had been tracked by the ancient monitoring systems. Tech Adept Zeth's analysis of the data produced calculations that would have been dismissed as impossible under normal circumstances. The combined mass of objects detected moving toward the galaxy suggested the approach of technological civilizations whose capabilities exceeded anything in recorded history. The energy signatures associated with their movement indicated access to power sources that Imperial science classified as theoretical impossibilities. Most ominously, the trajectory calculations showed that these approaching forces would reach the galaxy's outer regions within approximately 2 to 3 millennia, a time frame that appeared to coincide with increasingly desperate behavior from xenos species already fleeing before their advance. Macharius received these reports while personally leading the assault on Corellis Prime, a heavily fortified xenos stronghold that had been identified as a major coordination center for attacks against Imperial space. The siege demonstrated his tactical brilliance on a scale that impressed even veteran Space Marine commanders, as combined Imperial forces overwhelmed defenses that should have required years of grinding warfare to breach. The rapid victory provided access to intelligence assets that confirmed the most alarming aspects of the sensor station discoveries. The captured Xenos Command Center contains strategic planning documents that explicitly reference the Great Devouring and the Shadow from Beyond, terms that clearly corresponded to the approaching threat detected by the ancient monitoring systems. Enemy communications discussed preparation for the final flight and the last retreat, indicating that current conflicts with the Imperium were intended as delaying actions rather than serious attempts at conquest. Most chilling of all, the documents contained references to human space as the final sanctuary and discussed plans for sharing the burden of the coming dark. These discoveries forced Macharius to reevaluate both the scope of his mission and the timeline available for its completion. The approaching threat was real, massive, and inevitable. The various xenos species that had been attacking Imperial territory were not enemies in the traditional sense, but rather desperate refugees seeking sanctuary from something infinitely more dangerous. More importantly, whatever was approaching from beyond the galaxy's rim would eventually threaten human space, regardless of how successfully the Imperium dealt with current xenos incursions. The implications were staggering and terrifying. The Imperium faced not just the familiar challenge of defending its territory against known enemies, but the unprecedented crisis of preparing for confrontation with forces that possessed capabilities beyond human understanding. Traditional defensive strategies would prove entirely inadequate against threats of such magnitude, while the luxury of time for preparation was rapidly diminishing as the approaching danger drew ever closer to the galaxy's inhabited regions. Macharius made the decision that would ultimately define his legacy and determine the fate of everyone who followed him. Rather than reporting these discoveries to Terra and requesting guidance from the High Lords, he chose to expand the scope of his campaign beyond its original parameters. The Macharian Crusade would no longer be limited to eliminating xenos threats within or near Imperial space. Instead, it would push to the galaxy's very edge to investigate the approaching danger and prepare humanity for challenges that could dwarf any crisis in recorded history. The transformation of a successful military campaign into humanity's most desperate exploration of the unknown had begun, though few yet understood the true magnitude of what Macharius had committed them to discover. The manifestations of power that had convinced the High Lords to grant unprecedented authority were only the beginning of revelations that would ultimately challenge everything the Imperium believed about its place in the universe, and the nature of the darkness that waited beyond the stars. The third year of the Macharian Crusade marked the apex of what Imperial historians would later call the greatest military achievement since the Emperor himself had walked among mortals. By Men 41.395, Lord Solar Macharius commanded forces whose capabilities exceeded anything the galaxy had witnessed in over 10 millennia of human expansion. The Crusade had become a perfectly orchestrated instrument of conquest that combined technological superiority, tactical innovation, and logistical mastery on a scale that dwarfed the legendary campaigns of the Primarchs themselves. The foundations of this unprecedented success rested upon innovations that revolutionized every aspect of Imperial warfare. Traditional Crusade doctrine had relied upon sequential conquest of enemy positions, with each victory requiring substantial consolidation periods before forces could advance to new objectives. Macharius abandoned this approach entirely, developing what his staff termed cascade warfare that allowed continuous forward momentum while maintaining supply lines across vast interstellar distances. The key breakthrough came from studying xenos logistics networks captured during early campaign phases, which revealed transportation methods far more efficient than standard Imperial practice. Tech adept Coriel Zeth had successfully reverse-engineered alien supply vessels that incorporated gravitic manipulation systems unknown to Imperial science. These ships could carry 10 times the cargo of equivalent Imperial transports, while requiring significantly less fuel and maintenance. More importantly, they could establish supply depots on worlds lacking proper orbital facilities, allowing the Crusade to operate in regions where traditional Imperial logistics would have been impossible. Within 18 months, over 300 of these hybrid vessels had been constructed in mobile shipyards that accompanied the advancing fleet. The tactical doctrines developed during this golden period represented fundamental departures from established Imperial Guard methods. Macharius had recognized that traditional approaches to combined arms warfare, while effective against familiar enemies, proved inadequate when confronting technologically superior xenos forces. His solution involved integrating captured alien weapon systems with Imperial equipment to create combat capabilities that neither side could have achieved independently. The results were spectacular and terrifying in equal measure. Space Marine chapters participating in the Crusade found themselves equipped with power armor incorporating alien defensive technologies that rendered them nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons. Chapter Master Darnath Lysander of the Imperial Fists reported that his battle brothers could now survive direct hits from plasma cannons that would previously have proven fatal, while maintaining full mobility and combat effectiveness. The enhanced protection allowed Marine forces to undertake assault missions that would have been suicidal under normal circumstances, dramatically expanding tactical options available to Crusade commanders. Imperial Guard regiments benefited even more dramatically from technological integration programs overseen by Macharius personally. Standard lass weapons were upgraded with alien focusing crystals that tripled their effective range and destructive power, while maintaining the reliability and ease of maintenance that made lass technology ideal for mass deployment. Armor systems incorporated alien materials that provided protection equivalent to carapace armor, while weighing less than standard flak gear. Most remarkably, communication equipment enhanced with xenos technology allowed real-time coordination across light-years of space without relying on potentially compromised astropathic networks. The Titan legions participating in the Crusade underwent the most dramatic transformations of all Imperial forces. Princeps Majoris Curtis Mannheim of the Legio Griffonicus had initially resisted proposals to modify sacred god machines with alien technology, viewing such integration as potential heresy against the machine god. However, battlefield necessity forced reconsideration when Crusade forces encountered xenos war engines whose capabilities exceeded anything in Imperial arsenals. The first hybrid Titans, blessed by Fabricator General Lucas Crom himself, combined Imperial reactor technology with alien weapon systems to create instruments of destruction that could eliminate enemy super-heavy units with single volleys. Yet, the true genius of Macharius's approach lay not in technological innovation alone, but in the systematic integration of all Crusade elements into a unified strategic framework. Space Marine chapters that had operated independently for millennia found themselves cooperating with unprecedented efficiency under his command. Imperial Guard regiments from dozens of different worlds coordinated their operations seamlessly despite vastly different military traditions and cultural backgrounds. Even the notoriously independent Titan legions submitted to centralized tactical control that allowed their god machines to function as components of larger strategic operations rather than autonomous forces pursuing separate objectives. The organizational methods that enabled this integration had been developed through careful study of xenos command structures encountered during the Crusade's early phases. Many alien civilizations employed hierarchical systems that allowed rapid communication and coordination across vast distances without sacrificing local initiative or tactical flexibility. Macharius adapted these concepts to Imperial needs, creating command networks that maintained the initiative and aggression that defined human military culture, while incorporating the systematic efficiency that characterized successful xenos operations. Captain Thalassa of Macharius's personal staff documented the evolution of these command procedures in reports that would later become required reading at Imperial military academies throughout the galaxy. The key innovation involved establishing redundant communication networks that allowed orders to reach subordinate units through multiple channels simultaneously. If astropathic communication failed, backup systems using captured xenos technology could maintain coordination between widely separated force elements. If both primary and secondary networks were compromised, predetermined operational protocols allowed individual commanders to continue pursuing overall strategic objectives without specific guidance from higher authority. The logistical achievements of this period represented perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Crusades' golden age. Traditional imperial campaigns required massive supply chains that consumed enormous resources while remaining vulnerable to enemy interdiction. Macharius eliminated these weaknesses through systematic adoption of alien resource extraction and processing technologies that allowed Crusade forces to achieve strategic independence from traditional imperial supply networks. Mobile refineries could process raw materials found on captured worlds into ammunition, equipment, and consumables needed to sustain ongoing operations. Automated manufacturing systems produced replacement parts and new equipment using local resources rather than requiring shipments from distant imperial industrial centers. The scale of these achievements became apparent during the Xerxes campaign of M41.395, when Crusade forces simultaneously besieged 17 heavily fortified xenos strongholds across a region spanning over 200 light-years. Traditional imperial doctrine would have required concentrating available forces against individual objectives in sequence, allowing defenders to reinforce threatened positions while imperial forces remained committed to lengthy siege operations. Instead, Macharius deployed sufficient strength to overwhelm all 17 positions simultaneously while maintaining strategic reserves capable of responding to unexpected developments across the entire operational area. The campaign concluded in just 14 standard days, with the complete destruction of enemy forces and the capture of intact installations containing some of the most advanced technology ever recovered by Imperial expeditions. The speed of victory demonstrated capabilities that approached those attributed to the legendary Space Marine legions of the Great Crusade. While the minimal Imperial casualties proved that technological integration had created genuine tactical advantages rather than merely impressive but costly displays of superior firepower. Intelligence analysis of captured materials revealed the full scope of what the Crusade had accomplished during its golden period. Enemy communications intercepted during the Xerxes campaign contained references to Imperial forces that suggested fear approaching genuine terror among xenos leadership. Alien strategic assessments described human capabilities in terms that implied fundamental re-evaluation of the threat posed by Imperial expansion. Most significantly, several enemy species had apparently begun evacuating territories adjacent to Crusade operational areas, abandoning positions that had been maintained for centuries rather than risk confrontation with Macharius's forces. Yet even at the height of these unprecedented successes, careful observers noted troubling signs that the Crusades' golden age contained seeds of future problems. The technological integration programs that had proven so effective required constant maintenance by specialists who understood both Imperial and alien systems. As the Crusade advanced further from established Imperial territory, replacing equipment and personnel became increasingly difficult despite mobile manufacturing capabilities. More ominously, the alien technologies that provided such remarkable advantages often incorporated operating principles that even tech adepts found difficult to understand completely. Tech adept Zeth's private reports to Macharius expressed growing concern about the long-term sustainability of hybrid weapon systems that relied upon components whose function remained mysterious despite extensive analysis. Imperial engineers could manufacture replacement parts that duplicated alien specifications, but they could not always predict how modifications might affect system performance under combat conditions. Several incidents had already occurred where upgraded equipment failed at critical moments, though these failures had been masked by the overall success of Crusade operations. More disturbing still were reports of psychological effects among personnel who used alien-enhanced equipment for extended periods. Space Marines equipped with hybrid power armor reported sensory experiences that had no precedent in Astartes' service records. Imperial Guard soldiers using upgraded lass weapons occasionally described perceptual anomalies that might indicate neurological side effects from exposure to alien-focusing crystals. Titan princeps using modified god machines spoke of dreams and visions that seemed to originate from their machines rather than from their own minds. These concerns remained secondary considerations during the golden age of Crusade operations, when victory followed victory with mechanical precision, and Imperial forces seemed capable of overcoming any obstacle through superior strategy and technology. Macharius himself appeared immune to doubt or uncertainty, his confidence in the Crusade's ultimate success inspiring similar certainty among subordinate commanders. The momentum of continuous triumph created an atmosphere where questioning established procedures seemed not only unnecessary but potentially treasonous to the cause that had achieved such remarkable results. Yet beneath this surface confidence, Macharius was privately grappling with discoveries that challenged his fundamental assumptions about the nature of the threats facing humanity. The alien installations captured during the Golden Period contained records that suggested the approaching danger from beyond the galaxy's rim was far more immediate and terrifying than even his most pessimistic projections had indicated. The timeline for preparing Imperial defenses against this ultimate threat was shrinking rapidly, while the distance remaining to the galaxy's edge seemed to expand with each new revelation about the scale of space that lay beyond known stellar regions. The foundations established during the Crusade's Golden Age would soon face tests that their creators had never anticipated. The technological advantages that had proven so decisive against familiar xenos enemies might prove inadequate when confronted with forces that had driven advanced civilizations to flee across galactic distances. The organizational systems that had enabled unprecedented coordination among Imperial forces were about to encounter stresses that would challenge their most fundamental operating principles. Most ominously, the confidence and momentum that had carried the Crusade to heights of achievement, rivaling the Great Crusade itself, were approaching the moment when they would collide with realities that would test whether human determination could survive encounters with truths too terrible for mortal minds to fully comprehend. The fourth year of the Macharian Crusade witnessed something unprecedented in Imperial history, since the Great Crusade itself. What had begun as a military campaign to secure the Imperium's borders had evolved into a philosophical revolution that reshaped how humanity understood its destiny among the stars. The influence of Macharius and his methods spread far beyond the operational theater of his forces, inspiring changes throughout Imperial space that would outlive the Crusade itself by millennia. The core philosophy driving this transformation could be summarized in a single phrase that had become the unofficial motto of Crusade forces everywhere. Humanity's birthright encompasses all creation. This simple statement represented a fundamental departure from the defensive mindset that had dominated Imperial thinking for thousands of years. Rather than viewing the galaxy as a hostile environment where human survival required constant vigilance against overwhelming threats, Macharius presented space as humanity's natural domain that had been temporarily occupied by inferior species who would inevitably yield to superior human will and organization. This philosophical shift manifested itself in practical changes that revolutionized Imperial military doctrine across multiple sectors. Traditional defensive strategies that focused on fortifying existing territory gave way to aggressive expansion campaigns modeled on Crusade methods. Guard regiments that had spent centuries manning static defensive positions found themselves retrained for rapid deployment operations that prioritized mobility over fortification. Space Marine chapters that had grown accustomed to responding to threats after they materialized began launching preemptive strikes against potential enemies before they could organize effective resistance. The transformation was most dramatically visible in the Segmentum Solar, where proximity to Terra meant that news of Crusade victories reached military commanders within months, rather than years. Lord General Militant Crassus of the Scarus sector had initially dismissed reports of Macharius's achievements as exaggerated propaganda designed to boost morale among frontline troops. However, detailed analysis of captured xenos technology provided concrete evidence that the Crusade had indeed achieved breakthroughs that exceeded anything in recorded Imperial military history. The proof came in the form of weapon samples and technical specifications that Imperial Forge worlds could examine and potentially reproduce. Las weapon focusing crystals developed through alien technology. Integration programs demonstrated energy output improvements of over 300% compared to standard Imperial designs. Power armor enhancements provided protection levels that approached those of Terminator suits, while maintaining the mobility characteristics of standard Astartes equipment. Most remarkably, communication systems incorporating xenos technology allowed real-time coordination across interstellar distances without requiring astropathic support or risking warp-based security compromises. Forge World Lucius became the first Imperial industrial center to implement full-scale production of Crusade-developed technologies under the supervision of Tech Dominus Secutor Silex. The initial manufacturing runs required extensive modification of existing production facilities to accommodate alien material specifications and assembly procedures that differed significantly from traditional Imperial methods. However, the results justified the substantial investment of resources and expertise required for the conversion process. Within 18 months, Lucius was producing equipment that exceeded the performance of anything previously manufactured in Imperial space. The success of the Lucius project inspired similar initiatives throughout the Imperium, as Forge worlds competed to demonstrate their capability to support the new paradigm of aggressive expansion. Mars itself committed substantial resources to analyzing Crusade innovations, with Fabricator General Udia Raskian personally overseeing research programs that aimed to understand the fundamental principles underlying alien technologies rather than simply copying their external characteristics. The implications extended far beyond military applications, as improved understanding of gravitic manipulation and exotic energy systems offered possibilities for advances in civilian technology that could revolutionize Imperial society. Space Marine chapters throughout the galaxy began requesting assignment to operations that would allow them to experience Crusade methods firsthand. The Blood Angels, Imperial Fists, and Ultramarines each committed substantial forces to campaigns modeled on Macharian doctrine, though none achieved quite the same level of success as the original Crusade forces. The differences in results revealed the crucial importance of leadership and coordination in implementing the new tactical approaches effectively. Macharius possessed unique capabilities for managing complex multi-chapter operations that proved difficult to replicate even among the most experienced Astartes commanders. Captain General Tu Shan of the Salamanders provided perhaps the most insightful analysis of what made Macharian methods so effective in a report submitted to the Chapter Council of the Adeptus Astartes. The key factor was not technological superiority alone, but rather the systematic integration of all available resources into unified strategic frameworks that maximize the effectiveness of each component, while compensating for individual limitations. Traditional Imperial tactics treated Space Marines, Imperial Guard, and Titan forces as separate entities that happened to operate in the same theater. Macharius created genuinely combined arms formations where each element enhanced the capabilities of all others through carefully coordinated mutual support. The philosophical implications of this approach extended beyond military efficiency to challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of Imperial society itself. The rigid hierarchical structures that had dominated Imperial thinking since the Horus Heresy emphasized separation and specialization as safeguards against the kind of unified authority that had nearly destroyed humanity 10 millennia earlier. Macharius demonstrated that cooperation and integration could achieve results impossible through traditional methods, but his success also raised uncomfortable questions about whether Imperial paranoia about concentrated power had become counterproductive to human survival and expansion. These concerns found expression in heated debates within the Senatorum Imperialis as High Lords grappled with the implications of Crusade achievements for broader Imperial policy. Lord Commander of the Imperium Maximus Thane argued that Macharian methods represented dangerous precedents that could undermine the careful balance of power that had maintained Imperial stability for thousands of years. If individual commanders could achieve such dramatic results through concentrated authority, what would prevent future ambitious leaders from using similar methods to challenge the authority of Terra itself? Conversely, Master of the Administratum Violator Roskovler contended that the threats facing the Imperium had evolved beyond the capabilities of traditional organizational approaches to address effectively. The xenos technologies and tactical innovations encountered by the Crusade represented challenges that required responses exceeding anything within established Imperial doctrine. Failure to adapt Imperial methods to match evolving threat environments could result in strategic obsolescence that would prove far more dangerous than the theoretical risks of concentrated military authority. The debate remained unresolved, as reports continued to arrive documenting additional Crusade achievements that defied conventional understanding of what Imperial forces could accomplish. The conquest of the Corellis system had been completed in just 6 months, despite enemy defenses that should have required years of siege warfare to overcome. The Xerxes campaign had demonstrated the ability to coordinate simultaneous operations across hundreds of light years with precision that exceeded anything achieved since the days of the Primarchs. Most remarkably, casualties among Crusade forces remained minimal despite the unprecedented scope and intensity of their operations. Yet, even as Imperial authorities struggled to understand the full implications of these successes, troubling reports began to emerge from the Crusades' operational area that suggested challenges beyond anything previously encountered. Intelligence intercepts indicated that xenos forces were beginning to coordinate their responses to Imperial expansion on scales that transcended traditional species boundaries. Enemy communications referenced alliance formations that included civilizations with no apparent historical connections or shared interests beyond mutual opposition to human advancement. More disturbing still were references to something called the Final Compact that appeared to represent a desperate agreement among multiple xenos species to pool their resources for what they termed the Last Stand. The language used in these communications suggested that enemy forces viewed their conflict with the Imperium not as a territorial dispute that might be resolved through negotiation or limited warfare, but as an existential struggle where defeat would mean the complete extinction of their civilizations. Captain Lysander of the Imperial Fists encountered the first concrete evidence of this coordination during the assault on Boris Prime, a fortress world that had been identified as a major xenos command center. The defenders included species that Imperial xenobiologists had classified as naturally incompatible due to fundamental differences in environmental requirements and social organization. Yet these diverse alien forces fought with coordination that indicated extensive joint training and shared tactical doctrine. More ominously, their defensive preparations incorporated technologies from multiple civilizations, creating hybrid weapon systems whose capabilities exceeded anything that individual species had previously demonstrated. The implications became fully apparent during the post-battle analysis of captured equipment and intelligence materials. The Xenos alliance was not a temporary arrangement formed in response to immediate Imperial pressure, but rather a long-term strategic partnership that had been developing for centuries. Shared research programs had produced technological advances that individual species could never have achieved independently. Joint training exercises had created integrated command structures capable of coordinating multi-species operations with efficiency approaching that of the Crusade forces themselves. Most alarming of all, the captured intelligence contained references to human tactical doctrine that demonstrated detailed knowledge of Imperial military capabilities and limitations. Enemy forces had been studying Crusade operations with systematic thoroughness, analyzing Imperial methods and developing countermeasures designed to neutralize the advantages that had made Macharian expansion so successful. The technological and tactical superiority that had seemed so decisive during the Crusade's golden age was already being eroded by enemy adaptation and innovation. Macharius received these reports while personally leading the assault on Thrax, a heavily defended world that had become the focal point of xenos resistance in the sector. The siege demonstrated both the continued effectiveness of crusade methods and the growing sophistication of enemy countermeasures. Imperial forces achieved victory after 3 months of intense fighting, but the cost in personnel and equipment exceeded anything experienced during previous campaigns. More significantly, enemy forces had managed to evacuate most of their command personnel and critical technology before the final Imperial assault, suggesting that defeat was being used as an opportunity to gather intelligence on Imperial capabilities rather than as a genuine attempt to hold territory. The pattern that emerged from analysis of multiple similar engagements painted a disturbing picture of strategic developments that threatened to undermine the fundamental assumptions underlying crusade operations. Enemy forces were transitioning from territorial defense to intelligence gathering, using their defeats as opportunities to study Imperial methods while minimizing their own losses. The technological advantages that had seemed so decisive were being systematically analyzed and countered by opponents whose capabilities were improving with each encounter. Perhaps most ominously, the xenos communications intercepted during these operations contained increasing references to something approaching from beyond the galaxy's rim, described in terms that suggested both terror and desperate hope. The alien alliance was not simply opposing Imperial expansion for its own sake, but rather buying time for preparation against some greater threat that they viewed as infinitely more dangerous than human conquest. Their resistance was motivated not by territorial ambition or species pride, but by the desperate knowledge that failure to delay Imperial advance could result in humanity encountering dangers that could destroy both human and alien civilizations alike. The spreading influence of Macharian methods throughout Imperial space had created capabilities that exceeded anything achieved since the Great Crusade, but it had also attracted attention from forces whose nature and intentions remained terrifyingly unclear. The success that had seemed so complete and decisive was about to face challenges that would test whether human innovation and determination could survive encounters with realities that lay beyond the boundaries of known space and mortal understanding. The 5th year of the Macharian Crusade began with omens that even the most optimistic commanders could not ignore. What had started as isolated incidents during the previous campaign season had evolved into patterns of dysfunction that penetrated every level of Crusade operations. The perfect war machine that had conquered 400 worlds with mechanical precision was developing flaws that threatened to undermine everything Macharius had accomplished since receiving his mandate from the High Lords of Terra. The first clear indication that something fundamental had changed came during the routine resupply of battle group Xerxes in the outer reaches of the Corellis sector. Supply convoys that had operated with clockwork reliability for 3 years suddenly began experiencing inexplicable delays and equipment failures. Cargo vessels reported navigation anomalies that caused them to emerge from warp translation thousands of kilometers from their intended coordinates. More disturbing still, several ships arrived at their destinations with partial cargo loads, despite having departed from supply bases with full manifests and no recorded encounters with enemy forces. Tech Adept Seth conducted detailed investigations that revealed the true scope of these supply line disruptions. The navigation errors were not random mechanical failures, but rather systematic interference from sources that remained unidentifiable despite extensive sensor analysis. Something was deliberately disrupting Imperial supply operations using methods that exceeded the technological capabilities of any known xenos species. The missing cargo had not been lost to enemy action or mechanical failure, but had simply vanished from sealed storage compartments without any evidence of unauthorized access or structural damage to the containing vessels. Captain Thalassa of Macharius's personal staff documented these anomalies in reports that grew increasingly urgent as the pattern of disruptions expanded throughout the Crusade's operational area. Equipment failures began affecting frontline combat units with consequences that went far beyond mere logistical inconvenience. Las weapons incorporating alien focusing crystals experienced power fluctuations that rendered them unreliable during critical combat situations. Power armor systems enhanced with xenos technology began exhibiting behavioral anomalies that suggested external interference with their control systems. The psychological effects proved even more disturbing than the mechanical failures. Space Marines who had served with distinction throughout the Crusade's earlier phases began reporting sensory experiences that had no precedent in Astartes' service records. Battle Brothers equipped with hybrid power armor described auditory phenomena that seemed to originate from within their suits rather than from external sources. The sounds were not random noise, but rather structured patterns that suggested attempts at communication using frequencies outside normal human hearing ranges. Apothecary Fabius of the Imperial Fists conducted medical examinations that revealed neurological changes among affected personnel that could not be explained by known factors, such as combat stress or exposure to battlefield toxins. Brain activity patterns showed alterations in regions associated with sensory processing and threat assessment, suggesting that the hybrid technologies were affecting fundamental cognitive functions in ways that remained beyond Imperial medical understanding. Most alarmingly, these changes appeared to be progressive, becoming more pronounced the longer individuals used alien-enhanced equipment. Imperial Guard regiments throughout the Crusade began experiencing similar phenomena on a scale that threatened unit cohesion and operational effectiveness. Soldiers using upgraded LAS weapons reported visual disturbances that interfered with target acquisition and battlefield awareness. Communication equipment incorporating xenos technology occasionally transmitted signals that contained no intelligible content, but nonetheless caused psychological distress among personnel who heard them. Most concerning of all, troops exposed to these anomalies for extended periods began displaying behavioral changes that suggested gradual erosion of their loyalty to Imperial authority. The command structure that had functioned with unprecedented efficiency during the Crusade's golden age began showing signs of strain as these problems accumulated across multiple operational theaters. Orders transmitted through enhanced communication networks sometimes arrived at their destinations with subtle but significant alterations that changed their tactical implications. Coordination between widely separated force elements became increasingly difficult as commanders could no longer trust that their instructions were being received and interpreted correctly by subordinate units. Macharius himself remained seemingly immune to these effects, his personal equipment showing no signs of the anomalies that plagued other Crusade personnel. However, Those closest to him began to notice changes in his behavior and decision-making processes that suggested he was aware of problems that he was not sharing with his command staff. Private meetings with senior officers became more frequent and lasted longer, while his public appearances grew shorter and more focused on operational matters rather than the inspirational leadership that had characterized his earlier command style. Tech Dominus Kroll of the Adeptus Mechanicus attempted to analyze the source of these technological failures by examining the fundamental principles underlying the hybrid systems that had proven so effective during earlier campaign phases. His research revealed disturbing evidence that the alien technologies incorporated into Imperial equipment were not passive components that simply enhanced existing capabilities. Instead, they appeared to be active systems that maintained connections to sources outside Imperial space through mechanisms that remained beyond human understanding. The most alarming discovery involved the gravitational manipulation systems that had revolutionized Crusade logistics and transportation capabilities. Detailed analysis revealed that these systems were not self-contained devices that operated according to known physical principles, but rather interfaces that accessed external power sources located in regions of space that Imperial sensors could not detect. The energy being channeled through these systems was increasing in both quantity and complexity, suggesting that whatever provided the power was becoming more active as the Crusade advanced toward the galaxy's rim. Communication intercepts from xenos forces provided additional evidence that the technological anomalies were not random failures, but rather symptoms of deliberate interference from sources that remained unknown to both human and alien civilizations. Enemy transmissions contained references to the awakening and the stirring beyond that correlated with the timeline of increasing equipment failures throughout the Crusade. More ominously, alien communications suggested that the Xenos Alliance was experiencing similar technological disruptions that were affecting their ability to coordinate resistance against Imperial expansion. The implications became fully apparent during the Battle of Mordax, where Crusade forces encountered enemy defenders whose equipment was malfunctioning as severely as Imperial systems. Xenos weapon platforms that should have provided devastating firepower against attacking Imperial units instead delivered sporadic and unpredictable performance that allowed human forces to achieve victory despite being outnumbered and outgunned according to traditional tactical assessments. The captured enemy equipment showed signs of the same systematic interference that was plaguing Imperial technology, suggesting that whatever was causing these problems affected all advanced technological systems, regardless of their origin or operating principles. Captain Lysander led a reconnaissance mission to investigate abandoned xenos installations that had been recently evacuated, despite showing no signs of Imperial pressure or tactical necessity. What the Imperial forces discovered confirmed their worst suspicions about the nature of the threats facing both human and alien civilizations. The installations had been abandoned not because of external attack, but because their own technology had become unreliable to the point where continued operation was impossible. The evidence suggested that the advanced systems that both Imperial and Xenos forces had relied upon for their most critical operations were being systematically compromised by external influences that grew stronger as military operations approached the galaxy's edge. The technological superiority that had enabled the Crusades' remarkable achievements was being eroded by forces that could affect any sufficiently sophisticated equipment, regardless of its design principles or security measures. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the pattern of technological failures suggested that the interference was not random or indiscriminate, but rather targeted at specific systems that were crucial for maintaining military effectiveness across interstellar distances. Navigation equipment, communication networks, and weapon systems that incorporated advanced technology all showed signs of deliberate sabotage that appeared designed to isolate and weaken forces that ventured too far from their established support bases. Macharius convened emergency meetings with his senior commanders to address the crisis. But the discussions revealed the extent to which the Crusades' operational capabilities had been compromised. Standard Imperial technology remained functional, but the enhanced systems that had provided decisive advantages over enemy forces could no longer be trusted for critical operations. The choice facing Crusade leadership was whether to continue advancing using only traditional Imperial equipment, thereby surrendering the technological superiority that had made their achievements possible, or to risk continued reliance on systems that might fail at the worst possible moments. The decision became more urgent as intelligence reports indicated that xenos forces were adapting their tactics to exploit Imperial technological vulnerabilities. Enemy units that had been consistently defeated by superior Imperial equipment were beginning to achieve tactical successes against Crusade forces whose enhanced capabilities had been neutralized by systematic interference. The momentum that had carried the Macharian Crusade to unprecedented heights of achievement was being reversed by an opponent that remained invisible and apparently invincible. The realization that their greatest strengths had become potentially fatal weaknesses forced Crusade leadership to confront possibilities that challenged their fundamental assumptions about the nature of the campaign they were fighting. The technological integration that had seemed like humanity's greatest achievement since the Great Crusade was revealing itself as a trap that had been carefully prepared by an intelligence that understood both human and alien capabilities far better than either side understood themselves. As the fifth year of the Crusade drew to a close, Macharius faced the most difficult decision of his career. The forces under his command remained the largest and most powerful military formation in Imperial history, but their effectiveness was being systematically undermined by problems that could not be solved through tactical brilliance or strategic innovation. The enemy they faced was not simply another xenos species that could be defeated through superior firepower and organization, but rather something that could turn their own technology against them in ways that threatened to make continued advancement not just difficult, but potentially suicidal for everyone involved. The sixth year of the Macharian Crusade witnessed the emergence of an enemy unlike anything recorded in Imperial military history. What began as isolated encounters with technologically sophisticated xenos forces evolved into systematic confrontation with opponents whose capabilities suggested access to scientific principles that Imperial scholars had classified as theoretical impossibilities. The nature of this new threat would fundamentally alter the character of the Crusade and force Macharius to make decisions that would ultimately determine the fate of everyone who had followed him into the unknown reaches of space. The first major engagement occurred during the assault on Vanaheim, a fortress world that orbital reconnaissance had identified as a standard xenos military installation. Initial intelligence suggested defensive capabilities comparable to previously encountered enemy positions, with weapon emplacements and shield generators that should have succumbed to established Imperial assault tactics within a matter of weeks. Instead, the siege would continue for 6 months and cost the Crusade more casualties than all previous campaigns combined, while revealing enemy capabilities that defied rational explanation. The defenders possessed defensive systems that could predict Imperial tactics with uncanny accuracy, repositioning their forces to counterattacks before Imperial commanders had even issued the relevant orders. Enemy artillery strikes consistently targeted Imperial positions that had been selected only moments before the bombardments began, suggesting access to intelligence sources that penetrated the highest levels of Crusade command structure. Most disturbing of all, enemy forces demonstrated knowledge of Imperial technological vulnerabilities that had been closely guarded secrets known only to the most senior tech adepts and engineering specialists. Chapter Master Darnath Lysander of the Imperial Fists led the initial assault waves and reported enemy defensive measures that specifically countered the enhanced capabilities of hybrid power armor systems. Xenos weapon platforms delivered precisely calibrated energy bursts that overloaded alien-enhanced Imperial equipment while having minimal effect on standard Astartes gear. The technological advantages that had proven so decisive during earlier campaigns were not just neutralized, but actively turned against Imperial forces through countermeasures that seemed designed specifically to exploit the weaknesses inherent in hybrid technology integration. The breakthrough came when tech adept Zeth successfully captured an intact enemy command center and accessed the strategic databases that controlled defensive operations throughout the system. The intelligence recovered from this facility revealed the true scope of what the Crusade had encountered. The defenders were not simply another xenos species with advanced technology, but rather a coalition of civilizations whose combined knowledge exceeded anything previously documented in Imperial archives. The enemy alliance included species that Imperial xenobiologists had never encountered before, possessing technological capabilities that represented quantum leaps beyond anything achieved by previously known alien civilizations. Their weapon systems incorporated principles of physics that Imperial science had categorized as purely theoretical, while their manufacturing capabilities allowed them to produce equipment whose complexity exceeded even the most advanced Imperial archaeotech. Most ominously, their strategic databases contained detailed analyses of human military doctrine that demonstrated centuries of systematic study and preparation for confrontation with Imperial forces. Fabricator General Udia Raskian personally reviewed samples of captured enemy technology and declared them to represent scientific achievements that challenged fundamental assumptions about the limits of what was possible within known physical laws. Energy manipulation systems generated power outputs that should have required stellar mass reactors, while gravitational control devices created localized spatial distortions that allowed near-instantaneous movement across interstellar distances. The materials science underlying enemy equipment incorporated atomic structures that remained stable despite theoretical calculations, proving that such configurations should collapse within microseconds of formation. Yet the most disturbing discovery involved enemy intelligence about the Macharian Crusade itself. The captured databases contained complete tactical assessments of every major Imperial victory since the campaign's inception, along with detailed analysis of the technological innovations that had made those victories possible. Enemy forces had been studying Crusade operations with systematic thoroughness, developing countermeasures not just for current Imperial capabilities, but for future technological developments that Imperial engineers had not yet implemented. The strategic implications became apparent during subsequent engagements as enemy forces demonstrated ability to anticipate and counter Imperial tactical innovations almost as quickly as they could be deployed. New weapon systems that should have provided decisive advantages proved ineffective against enemies who had apparently prepared specific defenses before the weapons were even tested in combat. Communication networks that incorporated multiple layers of encryption were consistently compromised by opponents who seemed to understand Imperial coding procedures better than the specialists who had designed them. Captain Thalassa documented these developments in reports that grew increasingly desperate as the pattern of enemy superiority became undeniable. Traditional Imperial tactical doctrine relied upon technological and organizational advantages that allowed human forces to defeat numerically superior opponents through superior equipment and coordination. Against enemies who possessed both technological superiority and detailed knowledge of Imperial capabilities, these traditional advantages became active disadvantages that could be exploited by opponents who understood human limitations better than humans understood themselves. The psychological impact on Crusade personnel proved as damaging as the tactical reversals they were experiencing. Troops who had grown accustomed to technological superiority found themselves fighting with equipment that was not only inferior to enemy systems, but actively compromised by opponents who could predict and counter Imperial tactics with supernatural precision. The confidence that had sustained morale throughout years of continuous victory gave way to uncertainty and fear as casualties mounted while territorial gains diminished to negligible amounts. Space Marine chapters that had volunteered enthusiastically for Crusade operations began expressing concern about the sustainability of continued offensive operations against enemies whose capabilities exceeded anything in their training or experience. Chapter Master Vladimir Pugh of the Steel confessors submitted formal reports questioning whether the Imperial forces under Macharius's command possessed sufficient resources to achieve decisive victory against opponents who seemed to improve their capabilities faster than Imperial forces could adapt to changing tactical requirements. The crisis deepened when intelligence analysis revealed that enemy forces were not simply defending existing territory, but actively expanding their influence into regions that had previously been controlled by other xenos species. The technologically advanced coalition was absorbing or destroying less sophisticated alien civilizations with efficiency that exceeded anything demonstrated by Imperial conquest forces. Their expansion was creating a unified enemy realm whose resources and population dwarfed anything the Crusade could bring to bear against them. Macharius convened emergency strategy sessions with his senior commanders to address the deteriorating strategic situation, but the discussions revealed the extent to which traditional Imperial methods had become inadequate for dealing with the new threat. Standard siege tactics required technological superiority to overcome prepared defensive positions, while mobile warfare depended upon communication and coordination capabilities that enemy forces could disrupt or compromise at will. The tactical innovations that had proven so effective during earlier campaigns were being systematically neutralized by opponents who understood Imperial doctrine better than Imperial commanders understood enemy capabilities. The most alarming revelation came from analysis of captured enemy communications that referenced something called the Great Convergence, scheduled to occur when their forces reached what they termed the threshold. The enemy coalition was not simply defending territory or expanding for territorial gain, but rather preparing for some event that would occur when their expansion reached the galaxy's rim. References to the Awakening and the Final Calling suggested that their ultimate objectives extended far beyond conventional military conquest into realms that Imperial intelligence could not comprehend. Tech Dominus Kroll's investigation of enemy technology revealed evidence that their most advanced systems were not entirely self-contained, but rather drew power and guidance from sources located beyond the galaxy's edge. Energy signatures detected during equipment analysis suggested connections to locations in intergalactic space that should have been impossible to maintain using any known communication or power transmission methods. The implications were staggering and terrifying, suggesting that the technologically superior enemies confronting the Crusade were themselves merely advance agents for something far more powerful and dangerous. The pattern of enemy expansion began to make sense when viewed in this context. The coalition was not seeking to establish permanent territorial control over conquered regions, but rather to create a corridor of controlled space that extended from the galaxy's inhabited core to its outermost rim. Their resistance to Imperial expansion was motivated not by territorial ambition, but by the need to maintain this corridor for purposes that remained unclear, but obviously extended far beyond conventional military objectives. Perhaps most ominously, enemy forces began demonstrating capabilities that suggested they could influence Imperial technology and personnel from distances that exceeded the range of any known transmission or manipulation methods. Equipment failures throughout the Crusade's operational area showed patterns that correlated with enemy activities in distant regions, while psychological effects among Imperial personnel intensified whenever enemy forces achieved major tactical successes, regardless of the physical distance separating the affected individuals from the actual combat zones. The realization that confronted Macharius and his commanders was both simple and terrifying. The enemy they faced possessed not only technological superiority, but also capabilities that transcended normal limitations of space and time. Traditional military solutions were proving inadequate, not because Imperial forces lacked sufficient resources or tactical skill, but because the fundamental assumptions underlying human warfare had become obsolete when applied to opponents whose abilities operated according to principles that human science could neither understand nor effectively counter. The rising threat forced the Crusade to confront the possibility that continued advancement toward the galaxy's rim might result not in victory over enemy forces, but in encounter with realities that could destroy both human and alien civilizations, regardless of their technological capabilities or military prowess. The momentum that had carried Imperial forces to unprecedented heights of achievement was approaching collision with forces that made even the greatest human accomplishments seem insignificant by comparison. As the sixth year of the Crusade drew to a close, Macharius faced the most crucial decision of his career, and perhaps of human history. The forces under his command remained formidable by any conventional measure, but they were approaching confrontation with enemies whose nature and capabilities challenged everything the Imperium believed about the limits of what was possible in a universe governed by rational physical laws. The seventh year of the Macharian Crusade marked the point where Lord Solar Macharius abandoned every principle that had guided Imperial military doctrine for 10,000 years. Faced with enemies whose capabilities transcended conventional understanding and technological systems that had become actively hostile to human operation, he made decisions that would have been considered heretical under normal circumstances. The desperate innovations born from this crisis would prove more dangerous than the threats they were designed to counter, setting in motion events that would ultimately destroy everything the Crusade had achieved. The first radical departure from established protocol occurred during the siege of Mordax Prime, when Macharius authorized the deployment of weapon systems that had been classified as forbidden archaeotech by the Adeptus Mechanicus for over 3 millennia. The Castigator-class plasma annihilators had been deemed too dangerous for standard military use following incidents during the Age of Strife that had rendered entire star systems uninhabitable. Yet facing enemy defenses that proved immune to conventional Imperial firepower, Macharius concluded that the risks of using forbidden technology were preferable to the certainty of defeat through conventional means. Tech Dominus Kroll initially refused to activate the ancient weapon systems, citing safety protocols that had been established following catastrophic failures during their original deployment period. The plasma annihilators incorporated principles of stellar engineering that could theoretically ignite atmospheric gases or destabilize planetary cores if their containment systems were compromised. However, detailed analysis of enemy defensive capabilities revealed that nothing in the current Imperial arsenal possessed sufficient destructive potential to overcome the gravitational shields and spatial distortion fields protecting crucial enemy installations. The decision to proceed required override authorization from the highest levels of Imperial hierarchy. But communication delays with Terra meant that formal approval would take months to secure. Macharius made the choice to deploy the forbidden weapons without explicit permission, accepting personal responsibility for consequences that could potentially include charges of heresy and execution if the campaign failed to justify such extreme measures. The philosophical implications were staggering, as this decision represented the first time since the Horus Heresy that an Imperial commander had deliberately violated direct orders from the Adeptus Mechanicus regarding technology classified as too dangerous for military deployment. The results exceeded even optimistic projections. While confirming the most dire warnings about the risks involved in using such weapons, the plasma annihilators successfully breached enemy defenses that had proven impervious to all previous Imperial attacks, creating devastation that eliminated entire enemy army groups in single bombardments. However, the weapons also produced side effects that defied prediction and control, generating spatial anomalies that persisted long after the bombardments had concluded, and created environmental hazards that rendered portions of conquered territory permanently uninhabitable. More disturbing still, The ancient weapon systems demonstrated autonomous behaviors that suggested they retained some form of artificial intelligence, despite having been inactive for thousands of years. Targeting parameters occasionally shifted without operator input, while energy output levels fluctuated in patterns that appeared to respond to factors that Imperial tech specialists could not identify or predict. The weapons were achieving their tactical objectives, but they were doing so through methods that exceeded human understanding and control. Chapter Master Darnath Lysander reported that Space Marine forces operating in areas affected by plasma annihilator bombardments experienced equipment malfunctions and psychological effects similar to those associated with exposure to alien-enhanced. The forbidden Imperial weapons were apparently generating similar interference patterns to the compromised xenos systems, suggesting that both technologies shared fundamental characteristics that made them vulnerable to manipulation by the same external influences. The success of the forbidden weapons encouraged Macharius to authorize additional departures from established military doctrine that would have horrified previous Imperial commanders. Traditional rules of engagement that prohibited cooperation with xenos species were suspended when intelligence sources indicated that certain alien civilizations possessed information crucial for understanding the nature of the threats approaching from beyond the galaxy's rim. The decision to negotiate with enemy species represented a philosophical revolution that challenged basic Imperial beliefs about the inherent hostility of all non-human intelligence. The first formal alliance was established with a coalition of species calling themselves the Exodus Fleet, refugees who had been fleeing toward the galactic core for over 2,000 years. Their representatives provided intelligence about the forces pursuing them that confirmed Macharius's worst suspicions while revealing additional threats that Imperial analysts had not anticipated. The enemy coalition that the Crusade had been fighting was indeed connected to something approaching from intergalactic space, but that approaching force was itself fleeing from an even greater danger that had apparently consumed multiple galaxies beyond the local galactic group. The information provided by the Exodus fleet included technological specifications for defensive systems that had proven at least partially effective against the pursuing forces. However, implementing these technologies required modifications to Imperial equipment that violated virtually every safety protocol established by the Adeptus Mechanicus over the past 10 millennia. The defensive systems incorporated principles that bordered on what Imperial doctrine classified as daemonic technology, using methods that manipulated reality itself, rather than simply affecting matter and energy, according to known physical laws. Fabricator General Udia Raskian personally traveled to the Crusade's operational area to evaluate the alien technologies and determine whether their implementation could be justified, despite the enormous risks involved. His analysis revealed that the defensive systems operated by creating localized alterations to fundamental physical constants, essentially changing the basic laws of physics within limited areas to create conditions where attacking forces could not function effectively. The technology was theoretically sound, but practically indistinguishable from the reality-warping capabilities associated with chaos corruption. The decision to proceed with implementation required authorization from the highest levels of Imperial authority, but the communication delays and bureaucratic procedures involved would consume months that the Crusade could not afford to sacrifice. Macharius made the unprecedented choice to implement the alien defensive technologies without formal approval, accepting personal responsibility for potential consequences that could include excommunication from Imperial service and execution for trafficking with forbidden knowledge. The results proved both spectacular and terrifying. Imperial installations protected by the modified defensive systems became virtually invulnerable to enemy attack, while Imperial forces operating within the protected areas gained capabilities that approached those of the technologically superior enemy coalition. However, the psychological effects on personnel exposed to the reality warping fields were immediately apparent and profoundly disturbing. Soldiers reported perceptual distortions that made it difficult to distinguish between actual events and hallucinatory experiences, while equipment operators described sensory input that seemed to come from sources outside normal space-time. Most alarmingly, the defensive systems required continuous monitoring and adjustment by specialists who demonstrated increasing psychological instability the longer they worked with the alien technology. Tech adepts assigned to maintain the defensive fields began exhibiting behavioral patterns that suggested gradual erosion of their loyalty to Imperial authority and the cult Mechanicus. Their reports contained references to higher understanding and expanded consciousness that raised concerns about potential chaos corruption, despite the absence of any detectable warp influence in the affected areas. The crisis deepened when intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces were adapting to the new defensive technologies faster than Imperial specialists could refine and improve them. The technological advantages gained through implementation of alien systems proved temporary, as the enemy coalition developed countermeasures that not only neutralized the defensive fields, but actually turned them against Imperial forces. The reality warping technologies that had seemed like humanity's salvation became weapons that enemy forces could manipulate remotely to create devastating effects within Imperial installations. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the alien allies who had provided the defensive technologies began exhibiting behavioral changes that suggested they were not entirely trustworthy. Communications intercepts revealed that the Exodus fleet maintained contact with the enemy forces pursuing them, apparently providing information about Imperial capabilities and tactical developments in exchange for temporary cessation of attacks against their own vessels. The alliance that Macharius had hoped would provide salvation for humanity was potentially a trap designed to gather intelligence while weakening Imperial forces through exposure to corrupting technologies. The realization that every innovation was being turned against Imperial forces forced Macharius to confront the possibility that the threats facing the Crusade operated according to principles that made conventional military solutions not just inadequate, but actively counterproductive. Each attempt to match enemy capabilities resulted in new vulnerabilities that could be exploited more effectively than the original problems had been solved. The enemy coalition possessed not only technological superiority, but also strategic understanding that allowed them to anticipate and counter human innovations before they could be effectively implemented. The seventh year concluded with Crusade forces possessing capabilities that exceeded anything in Imperial military history, while simultaneously being more vulnerable to enemy attack than they had been at the campaign's inception. The forbidden technologies and alien alliances that Macharius had authorized provided tremendous tactical advantages, but they also created dependencies and vulnerabilities that enemy forces could exploit with devastating effectiveness. The desperate innovations born from crisis had transformed the Macharian Crusade into something that bore little resemblance to traditional imperial military operations. As the 8th year of the campaign approached, Macharius faced the most difficult decision of his career. The forces under his command retained enormous destructive potential, but their effectiveness was increasingly dependent upon technologies and alliances that might prove more dangerous than the enemies they were designed to counter. The momentum that had carried the crusade to unprecedented achievements was approaching the point where continued advancement might result in discoveries that could destroy not just the expedition itself, but potentially threaten the stability of the entire Imperium. The desperate innovations that had seemed necessary for survival were revealing themselves as steps toward transformation into something that could no longer be considered truly human. The choice facing Macharius and his forces was whether to continue their advance toward the galaxy's rim, despite the mounting evidence that such advancement might result in encounters with realities that could fundamentally alter or destroy everything they had sought to protect through their service to the Emperor and the Imperium of man. The 8th year of the Macharian Crusade began with a discovery that would shatter every assumption about the nature of the galaxy and humanity's place within it. When Crusade forces finally reached the coordinates that marked the theoretical edge of known space, they encountered not the empty void that Imperial astronomers had predicted, but rather evidence of structures and activities that defied rational explanation. What Lord Solar Macharius found in that darkness beyond the stars would drive him to make the most controversial decision in Imperial military history, setting in motion the events that would ultimately destroy the greatest military force assembled since the Great Crusade itself. The initial reconnaissance missions were conducted by modified vessels equipped with the most advanced sensor arrays available to Imperial technology, supplemented by alien detection systems provided by the Exodus Fleet Alliance. Captain Lysander led the first expedition beyond the galactic rim aboard the strike cruiser Fist of Dawn, accompanied by elements of the 15th Mordian Iron Guard and a full complement of tech specialists from the Adeptus Mechanicus. What they discovered in the void between galaxies would challenge everything the Imperium believed about the fundamental nature of reality. The sensors detected massive artificial structures existing in apparent violation of known physical laws, floating in interstellar space without any visible means of support or power generation. These constructions dwarfed anything in Imperial experience, with individual components measuring hundreds of kilometers in length and exhibiting architectural principles that suggested engineering capabilities beyond anything achieved by known civilizations. Most disturbing of all, the structures appeared to be growing, expanding their size and complexity through processes that remained completely beyond human understanding. Tech Dominus Kroll's analysis of the sensor data revealed energy signatures that corresponded to no known source or type, while the materials comprising the structures showed properties that should have been impossible according to established principles of physics and chemistry. The constructions seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time, occupying dimensions that Imperial science had classified as purely theoretical. Their presence in the void between galaxies suggested technological capabilities that exceeded even the most optimistic projections of what advanced civilizations might eventually achieve. The first direct contact occurred when one of the reconnaissance vessels received communications in languages that bore no resemblance to any known form of human or alien communication. The messages were transmitted using methods that bypassed all known principles of electromagnetic radiation and subspace communication, appearing to arrive instantaneously regardless of the distance between sender and receiver. More disturbing still, the communications seemed to contain information about Imperial forces and their mission that could only have been obtained through surveillance methods that remained completely undetectable to Crusade sensors. The translation efforts revealed content that fundamentally challenged Imperial understanding of galactic history and the nature of the threats facing humanity. The entities responsible for the communications claimed to be representatives of civilizations that had existed before the formation of the galaxy itself, survivors of cosmic cycles that spanned billions of years and encompassed the rise and fall of countless stellar systems. Their messages spoke of approaching events that would determine whether life itself could survive the transition to what they termed the next configuration. According to these ancient entities, the structures detected in intergalactic space were preparation facilities for a transformation that occurred periodically throughout cosmic history. The process involved the systematic reorganization of matter and energy on galactic scales, essentially rebuilding the universe according to principles that would allow continued existence under changed physical conditions. The civilizations that had built the structures were attempting to preserve some form of life through this transformation, but their methods required the cooperation of all intelligent species within the affected galactic regions. The implications were staggering and terrifying. The approaching transformation was not a hostile invasion that could be defeated through military action, but rather a fundamental alteration of reality itself that would occur regardless of any resistance that local civilizations might offer. The only choice facing intelligent species was whether to cooperate with the preservation efforts or face extinction when the transformation commenced. The various alien species that had been fleeing toward the galactic core were not refugees from conquest, but rather participants in a desperate attempt to reach designated preservation sites before the transformation began. Macharius received these reports while leading the assault on what had been identified as the final enemy stronghold in the galactic rim region. The intelligence fundamentally altered his understanding of the strategic situation and forced him to confront possibilities that challenged everything he had believed about the purpose and goals of the Crusade. The enemy forces that his expedition had been fighting were not opponents to be defeated, but rather potential allies in a struggle for survival that transcended any previous human experience or understanding. The decision to establish formal contact with the ancient entities required authorization from Terra that would take months to secure, while the communications from beyond the galaxy's edge suggested that the transformation was approaching much more rapidly than anyone had anticipated. Macharius made the choice to proceed with negotiations without explicit Imperial approval, accepting personal responsibility for consequences that could include charges of heresy and treason if the initiative failed to produce results that justified such extreme actions. The formal contact sessions were conducted aboard the flagship Macharius himself, with representatives from the ancient entities manifesting through technological means that remained beyond Imperial understanding. The beings appeared as shifting patterns of light and energy that occasionally coalesced into forms that suggested vast intelligence operating according to principles completely unlike human consciousness. Their communications revealed the true scope of the challenges facing all life in the galaxy and the limited options available for survival. The preservation process required the systematic collection and storage of biological and technological information from all intelligent species within the affected galactic region. The data would be used to reconstruct viable civilizations following the transformation, but the process necessitated the temporary dissolution of existing social and technological structures. Individuals and groups that entered the preservation systems would be maintained in states that resembled death, but allowed recovery once suitable environmental conditions had been re-established in the transformed galaxy. The ancient entities had been attempting to establish preservation sites throughout the galaxy for thousands of years, but their efforts had been consistently opposed by species that refused to accept the necessity of temporary dissolution. The various conflicts that had plagued the galactic rim were actually desperate attempts by different civilizations to either reach preservation sites or prevent their implementation, depending on their understanding of and willingness to accept the preservation process. Most disturbing of all, the entities revealed that they had been monitoring human expansion since the Great Crusade, and had identified the Imperium as potentially crucial for the success of the preservation efforts. Human organizational capabilities and technological adaptability made Imperial civilization an ideal candidate for serving as the foundation for reconstructed galactic society following the transformation. However, cooperation required acceptance of the preservation process by Imperial leadership, along with willingness to abandon traditional human concepts of individual survival and cultural continuity. The revelation that humanity had been selected for special consideration in the preservation efforts created divisions within the Crusade leadership that threatened to tear apart the unity that had sustained the expedition through years of unprecedented challenges. Chapter Master Vladimir Pugh of the Steel Confessors argued that cooperation with the ancient entities represented betrayal of fundamental imperial principles and loyalty to the emperor himself. The preservation process, regardless of its purported benefits, would require the temporary destruction of human civilization and the acceptance of transformation into something that could no longer be considered truly human. Conversely, Tech Dominus Kroll contended that refusal to cooperate would result in the complete extinction of humanity when the transformation occurred, regardless of imperial preferences. The choice was not between preservation of human civilization and its destruction, but rather between temporary dissolution with possibility of reconstruction and permanent annihilation with no hope of recovery. From this perspective, cooperation with the ancient entities represented the only rational response to an unavoidable cosmic event. The debate intensified when additional intelligence revealed that the entities had been covertly influencing Imperial technology and personnel throughout the Crusade's duration. The equipment failures and psychological effects that had plagued Crusade forces were not random malfunctions or enemy sabotage, but rather preparation processes designed to gradually accustom human personnel to the altered states of consciousness required for successful preservation. The alien technologies that had provided such remarkable capabilities were actually components of preservation systems that had been slowly integrating with Imperial equipment. The realization that Crusade forces had been unknowingly participating in preparation for preservation created panic among personnel who had believed they were fighting to defend human civilization rather than to transform it into something unrecognizable. Morale collapsed as troops discovered that their enhanced capabilities were actually symptoms of gradual conversion into forms compatible with preservation requirements. The technological advantages that had enabled their remarkable military achievements were revealed as steps toward abandonment of human identity itself. Perhaps most devastating was the discovery that the entire Macharian crusade had been orchestrated by the ancient entities as a method for gathering and preparing human forces for preservation. Macharius himself had been selected and influenced to propose the expedition, while the various challenges and innovations encountered during the campaign had been designed to test and develop human adaptability for survival through the transformation process. What had seemed like humanity's greatest military achievement was actually an elaborate recruitment and training program for cosmic preservation efforts. The great betrayal was not the revelation that alien entities had deceived humanity about the nature of the threats they faced, but rather the discovery that humanity itself had been selected for transformation into something that transcended traditional concepts of human existence. The choice facing Macharius and his forces was whether to embrace this transformation as salvation from cosmic extinction or to reject it as the ultimate corruption of everything they had sworn to protect and serve. The revelation of humanity's intended role in the cosmic preservation process triggered the complete disintegration of everything that had made the Macharian Crusade the most successful military expedition in Imperial history. Within weeks of the first contact sessions with the ancient entities, the unified command structure that had coordinated operations across hundreds of star systems began fragmenting into competing factions whose fundamental disagreements about the nature of human identity and survival could not be resolved through negotiation or compromise. Chapter Master Darnath Lysander of the Imperial Fists became the focal point for opposition to cooperation with the preservation process, arguing that acceptance of transformation represented betrayal of the most sacred oaths that bound Space Marines to the Emperor and the Imperium. The Adeptus Astartes had been created to defend humanity against all threats, including those that claimed to offer salvation through fundamental alteration of human nature. From this perspective, the ancient entities were simply another form of chaos corruption that used promises of transcendence to seduce their victims into willing participation in their own destruction. The psychological impact of these revelations proved devastating for personnel who had dedicated years of their lives to what they had believed was humanity's greatest military achievement. Imperial Guard regiments that had fought with fanatical devotion throughout the Crusade found themselves questioning not just the mission's ultimate objectives, but the fundamental meaning of their service to the Emperor and the Imperium itself. If their greatest victory was actually preparation for abandonment of human identity, then what value could any Imperial achievement possess in the face of cosmic forces that transcended human understanding and control? Tech Dominus Kroll attempted to maintain scientific objectivity in analyzing the situation, but even his reports reflected the overwhelming nature of the philosophical crisis confronting Crusade leadership. The preservation process offered genuine possibility for survival through cosmic transformation that would otherwise result in complete extinction. but acceptance required abandonment of every principle that had guided human civilization since the Emperor had first united Terra under Imperial rule. The choice was between certain death as humans and uncertain survival as something else entirely. The fragmentation accelerated when communication intercepts revealed that different Space Marine chapters were reaching contradictory conclusions about their obligations under these unprecedented circumstances. The Firehawks and Minotaurs announced their intention to comply with preservation requirements, viewing cooperation as the ultimate expression of their duty to ensure humanity's survival regardless of personal cost. Conversely, the Imperial Fists and Steel Confessors declared that preservation represented heresy equivalent to chaos worship and began preparing for armed resistance against both the ancient entities and any Imperial forces that chose to cooperate with them. Macharius found himself caught between irreconcilable positions that threatened to tear apart not just his expeditionary force, but potentially the entire Imperium, if news of the cosmic transformation reached Terra before appropriate preparations could be implemented. The traditional command authority that had enabled him to coordinate the largest military force since the Great Crusade proved completely inadequate for resolving conflicts that involved fundamental questions about the nature of human existence and the proper response to cosmic-scale threats. The first open violence occurred when elements of the Imperial Fists attempted to destroy preservation facilities that had been established on several conquered worlds, with the cooperation of local tech adepts and Imperial Guard units. The resulting firefights pitted Space Marines against Space Marines in fratricidal combat that would have been unthinkable under any previous circumstances. The sight of Astartes' forces exchanging fire with battle brothers from different chapters shattered morale among Imperial Guard regiments, whose loyalty depended upon the perception that the Space Marines represented unshakable unity in service to the Emperor. Captain Thalessa documented the collapse of command authority in reports that grew increasingly desperate as traditional military hierarchy proved incapable of maintaining order among forces whose fundamental beliefs about their mission had been shattered by revelations that challenged every assumption about human destiny. Orders issued by senior commanders were being questioned, modified, or completely ignored by subordinate units whose loyalty had been undermined by uncertainty about whether cooperation or resistance represented the proper response to cosmic transformation. The logistical systems that had sustained Crusade operations across vast interstellar distances began failing as supply. Convoys found themselves caught between competing factions that viewed each other as potential enemies. Transport vessels carrying preservation equipment were attacked by Imperial forces that considered such materials to be heretical corruption, while ships attempting to evacuate personnel from preservation sites were interdicted by units that viewed such evacuations as treason against humanity's cosmic destiny. The technological integration that had provided such remarkable military capabilities became a source of additional conflict as different factions attempted to control or destroy equipment that might facilitate either cooperation with or resistance to the preservation process. Hybrid weapon systems incorporating alien technology were sabotaged by personnel who viewed them as instruments of corruption, while defenders of preservation sites used the same technologies to repel attacks from Imperial forces that had once been their allies. The breakdown of unity spread beyond military considerations to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of imperial authority itself. If the Emperor's vision of human expansion and dominance throughout the galaxy was ultimately meaningless in the face of cosmic transformation, then what legitimacy could any imperial institution claim for its decisions and policies? The philosophical implications threaten to undermine not just the Crusade's mission, but the entire ideological foundation upon which imperial civilization had been constructed. Tech-adept Zeth's final reports contained analysis suggesting that the factional conflicts were being influenced by the same external forces that had shaped Crusade operations throughout their duration. The ancient entities possessed capabilities for manipulating human psychology and technology that exceeded anything within Imperial experience, while their agenda apparently included testing human responses to extreme stress and ideological conflict. The civil strife that was destroying the Crusade might itself be another component of the selection and preparation process for cosmic preservation. The revelation that their conflict might be artificially induced rather than representing genuine philosophical differences proved even more demoralizing than the original discoveries about cosmic transformation. If the factions could not trust their own beliefs and motivations, then no basis existed for making rational decisions about cooperation or resistance. The ancient entities had apparently anticipated every possible human response to preservation requirements and had developed methods for manipulating those responses to achieve their desired outcomes regardless of human preferences. Perhaps most devastating was the growing realization that the Crusade's isolation at the galaxy's rim meant that the factional conflicts could continue indefinitely without any external authority possessing sufficient knowledge or resources to intervene effectively. Communication with Terra required months for message transmission, while the High Lords lacked the context necessary to understand the nature of the crisis or formulate appropriate responses. The Crusade forces were effectively abandoned to resolve conflicts that exceeded any previous Imperial experience or institutional capability. The cascading collapse accelerated when intelligence reports indicated that the cosmic transformation was approaching much more rapidly than anyone had anticipated. The ancient entities revealed that the preservation process could not be delayed indefinitely, while human factions debated their response, as the timing was determined by cosmic events that operated according to schedules that transcended local preferences. Humanity would be preserved or perish according to decisions that had to be made within a time frame measured in months rather than years. The pressure created by this deadline intensified the factional conflicts to the point where rational discussion became impossible. Each side viewed delay as favoring their opponent's agenda, while the ancient entities provided contradictory information that seemed designed to increase rather than resolve the confusion surrounding preservation requirements. The unity that had sustained the Crusade through years of unprecedented challenges disintegrated entirely as former allies prepared for civil war that would determine humanity's response to cosmic transformation. Macharius himself became increasingly isolated, as even his most trusted advisors split into competing camps that viewed his leadership as either essential for implementing preservation or as the primary obstacle to effective resistance. The personal loyalty that had enabled him to coordinate the greatest military force in Imperial history proved inadequate for maintaining authority over forces whose fundamental understanding of their mission and purpose had been shattered by revelations that challenged every assumption about human destiny and imperial authority. The final stage of collapse occurred when communication with the preservation sites revealed that the transformation process had already begun in some regions of the galaxy, with entire star systems disappearing from sensor detection as they were converted to configurations compatible with the altered physical laws that would govern the transformed universe. The cosmic deadline was not a future threat to be planned for, but rather a present reality that was consuming the galaxy regardless of human decisions about cooperation or resistance. The cascading collapse that destroyed the Macharian Crusade represented more than the failure of a single military expedition. It marked the end of humanity's last attempt to expand beyond the limitations imposed by cosmic forces that operated according to principles beyond human understanding or control. The greatest achievement in Imperial military history had become humanity's final confrontation with realities that challenged the very foundations of what it meant to be human, in a universe where survival itself required transformation into something entirely different. The end came not with the thunder of orbital bombardment or the clash of armies meeting in honorable combat, but with silence. On the 23rd day of Tertius in Emmerth 41.400, Lord Solar Macharius was found dead in his private quarters aboard the flagship that bore his name, victim of what the expedition's chief medicae declared to be acute systemic poisoning from an unknown toxin that left no trace in his bloodstream or tissue samples. The man who had conquered 1,000 worlds and pushed the boundaries of imperial expansion further than any commander since the Emperor himself, died alone, killed by someone within his own inner circle, whose identity would never be definitively established. The circumstances surrounding Macharius's death reflected the complete breakdown of trust and loyalty that had consumed the expedition during its final months. By the time his body was discovered by Captain Thalossa during a routine morning briefing, the Crusade's command structure had already fractured into competing factions whose mutual hostility exceeded their shared opposition to external threats. The preservation crisis had created divisions so fundamental that former allies viewed each other as greater enemies than the cosmic forces that threatened all human existence. Chapter Master Darnath Lysander of the Imperial Fists had been conducting his own investigation into what he termed preservation corruption among senior Crusade leadership, focusing particular attention on personnel who had demonstrated willingness to cooperate with the ancient entity's transformation requirements. His reports suggested that certain members of Macharius's inner circle had been psychologically compromised by exposure to alien preservation technologies, making them potential security threats whose loyalty to traditional imperial values could no longer be trusted. Conversely, Tech Dominus Kroll had identified what he believed to be a conspiracy among traditionalist elements within the expedition to sabotage preservation preparations through systematic destruction of critical equipment and assassination of personnel who supported cooperation with the cosmic transformation process. His analysis indicated that resistance leaders were prepared to commit any action, including murder of Imperial commanders, to prevent what they viewed as heretical abandonment of human identity and Imperial authority. The investigation into Macharius's death revealed the extent to which paranoia and factional hatred had penetrated every level of the expedition's organization. Medical examination of his personal effects uncovered evidence that he had been consuming experimental drugs designed to counteract the psychological effects of preservation technology exposure, suggesting that he had been attempting to maintain mental clarity while navigating between irreconcilable positions held by his subordinate commanders. The toxin that killed him was apparently administered through these medications, indicating that someone with intimate knowledge of his private medical regime had orchestrated his assassination. Captain Thalas's security investigation identified at least 7 individuals who possessed both the access and motivation necessary to poison their commander. But the evidence proved inconclusive due to systematic destruction of records and testimony by witnesses whose allegiances remained uncertain. The factional divisions that had torn apart the expedition's unity also compromised the investigative process, as different groups attempted to implicate their rivals while concealing their own potentially treasonous activities. The immediate aftermath of Macharius's death triggered the final collapse of any pretense of unified command authority within the expedition. Each major faction claimed that their interpretation of his final intentions justified their assumption of leadership responsibilities, while simultaneously accusing rival groups of responsibility for his assassination. The Space Marine chapters split along philosophical lines that reflected their positions on the preservation crisis, with some supporting immediate withdrawal from the galactic rim, while others advocated complete commitment to cooperation with the ancient entities. Chapter Master Vladimir Pugh of the Steel Confessors assumed command of traditionalist forces that rejected any form of cooperation with preservation requirements, declaring that Macharius's death proved the corrupting influence of alien contact on Imperial leadership. His faction included elements of the Imperial Fists, substantial numbers of Imperial Guard regiments from multiple worlds, and tech adepts who viewed preservation technology as heretical corruption that violated the fundamental principles of the cult Mechanicus. Tech Dominus Kroll emerged as the leader of pro-preservation forces that viewed cooperation with the ancient entities as humanity's only hope for survival through cosmic transformation. His coalition included the Firehawks and Minotaurs chapters, along with Imperial Guard units that had been most extensively exposed to hybrid technologies during the expedition's earlier phases. These forces controlled most of the preservation facilities that had been established on conquered worlds, along with the technical expertise necessary to operate the alien systems that might enable human survival through the transformation process. The conflict that erupted between these factions transcended traditional military engagement to become something approaching religious warfare over fundamental questions about the nature of human identity and destiny. Both sides possessed intimate knowledge of their opponent's capabilities and tactical preferences, having served together for years under unified command. The result was fratricidal combat of unprecedented savagery, as former allies employed their detailed understanding of Imperial doctrine to inflict maximum casualties on forces they had once considered brothers in arms. The Battle of Mordian's Edge became the largest single engagement of the civil conflict, as traditionalist and pro-preservation forces clashed over control of the expedition's primary logistics base and communication facilities. The fighting lasted for 6 days and resulted in the complete destruction of infrastructure that had sustained Crusade operations for years, while casualties exceeded those suffered during any previous engagement with external enemies. Space Marines fought Space Marines in combat that violated every principle of brotherhood that had bound the Adeptus Astartes together since their creation. The technological advantages that had enabled the expedition's remarkable military achievements became weapons turned against Imperial forces themselves, as both factions employed alien-enhanced equipment to devastating effect. Hybrid weapon systems designed for use against external enemies proved equally effective against Imperial power armor and defensive installations, while the enhanced communication networks that had enabled unprecedented coordination were used to intercept and counter enemy movements with tragic efficiency. Perhaps most devastating was the discovery that the ancient entities were actively monitoring and potentially influencing the fratricidal conflict through the preservation technologies that both factions continued to use despite their ideological disagreements. Intelligence reports suggested that the Civil War itself might be another component of the selection process for cosmic transformation, designed to test human responses to extreme stress while eliminating individuals deemed unsuitable for preservation through the coming cosmic changes. The realization that their conflict might be serving the agenda of the very entities they were debating whether to trust or resist proved demoralizing to personnel on both sides of the factional divide. If their actions were being manipulated regardless of their conscious intentions, then the philosophical principles motivating their struggle might be meaningless in the face of cosmic forces that operated according to logic beyond human comprehension or resistance. The final phase of the civil conflict occurred when preservation sites throughout the operational area began activating automatically as the cosmic transformation accelerated beyond the point where local decisions could affect its implementation. Personnel within the activation zones found themselves subjected to preservation processes regardless of their personal beliefs about cooperation or resistance, while those outside the affected areas could only observe as their former comrades disappeared into states that resembled death, but might enable recovery in the transformed universe. The automatic activation of preservation systems effectively ended the ideological debate that had torn apart the expedition by making cooperation or resistance irrelevant to the actual implementation of cosmic transformation. The ancient entities had apparently possessed sufficient understanding of human psychology to predict that factional conflict would prevent rational decision-making, and had therefore designed the preservation process to proceed according to predetermined parameters regardless of human preferences or consent. Macharius's death marked not just the end of his personal command authority, but the final failure of human agency in determining humanity's response to cosmic transformation. The greatest military commander in Imperial history had been reduced to a casualty of factional conflict that served the agenda of entities whose motivations and methods transcended human understanding. His assassination eliminated the only individual who might have possessed sufficient authority and vision to navigate between the irreconcilable positions that had destroyed the expedition's unity. The silence that followed his death was not the peaceful quiet of completed victory, but rather the empty stillness that marks the end of human relevance in conflicts that operate according to cosmic scales and timelines. The Macharian Crusade had achieved unprecedented military success, only to discover that such achievements were meaningless when measured against forces that viewed entire galaxies as temporary arrangements to be modified according to incomprehensible requirements. The final battle of the Macharian Crusade was fought not against external enemies that could be defeated through superior tactics and technology, but against the fundamental limitations of human understanding and control when confronted with realities that exceeded mortal comprehension. The tragedy was not that humanity had been defeated by superior opponents, but rather that victory itself had been revealed as preparation for transformation into something that could no longer be considered human in any meaningful sense. The death of Lord Solar Macharius created a power vacuum that no surviving commander possessed the authority or capability to fill effectively. Within hours of the discovery of his body, the expedition's remaining forces began the chaotic process of withdrawal from the galactic rim that would consume years and cost more lives than any previous phase of the campaign. The retreat became a nightmare of competing authorities, abandoned equipment, and desperate attempts to maintain unit cohesion while traversing hundreds of light-years of space that had become actively hostile to human presence. The immediate crisis centered on the question of who possessed legitimate authority to order the withdrawal and coordinate the massive logistical operation required to evacuate forces that had been dispersed across dozens of star systems. Chapter Master Darnath Lysander claimed command authority based on his seniority among Space Marine commanders and his opposition to what he termed the preservation heresy that had corrupted the expedition's original mission. However, his authority was challenged by Tech Dominus Kroll, who argued that the technical complexities of evacuation required leadership from someone who understood the alien technologies that had become integral to Crusade operations. The competing claims created immediate, practical problems as different units received contradictory orders regarding evacuation priorities and destinations. Space Marine forces loyal to traditionalist principles began abandoning positions without coordinating with Imperial Guard units that remained under Tech Adept command, while preservation site personnel found themselves isolated when their protective escorts withdrew without notification. The result was a fragmented retreat that maximized casualties while minimizing the effectiveness of evacuation efforts. Captain Thalasser attempted to maintain some semblance of unified command by establishing communication protocols that allowed different faction leaders to coordinate their withdrawal efforts without acknowledging each other's authority claims. However, these arrangements proved fragile as the stress of evacuation exacerbated existing factional tensions and created new conflicts over resource allocation and route priorities. The sophisticated command networks that had enabled unprecedented coordination during the expedition's advance became sources of confusion and conflict during the retreat. The technological crisis that had plagued the expedition's final months intensified dramatically as forces attempted to withdraw from regions where reality itself had been altered by preservation processes and cosmic transformation effects. Navigation systems experienced failures that stranded entire fleets in interstellar space, while communication equipment began transmitting signals that originated from sources outside normal space-time. Most disturbing of all, Personnel exposed to preservation technologies found themselves experiencing physical and psychological changes that made them incompatible with standard Imperial equipment and procedures. Tech adept Zeth documented these phenomena in reports that revealed the full scope of the challenges facing evacuation efforts. The hybrid technologies that had provided such remarkable capabilities during the expedition's advance were actively resisting attempts to withdraw them from the Galactic Rim region. Weapon systems refused to function when removed from areas affected by preservation processes, while transportation equipment experienced catastrophic failures when attempting to traverse the boundary between transformed and normal space. The preservation sites themselves had become focal points for anomalous activity that threatened anyone who approached them during the withdrawal process. Personnel who had entered preservation states could not be safely removed without risking permanent death, while the facilities themselves generated fields that caused severe psychological disturbance among individuals who remained conscious in their vicinity. The choice facing evacuation commanders was whether to abandon preserved personnel entirely or risk additional casualties in futile rescue attempts. Imperial Guard regiments that had served with distinction throughout the expedition's duration found themselves fragmented and demoralized by the revelation that their greatest achievements had been orchestrated by entities whose agenda remained incomprehensible to human understanding. Units that had conquered dozens of worlds discovered that their victories were meaningless when measured against cosmic transformation that rendered territorial control irrelevant. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the physical challenges of withdrawal from regions where normal cause and effect relationships no longer functioned reliably. The evacuation convoys became targets for attack by alien forces that had apparently been waiting for human withdrawal to begin their own escape from the cosmic transformation zone. These species possessed detailed knowledge of Imperial tactical procedures and equipment vulnerabilities, suggesting that they had been studying Crusade operations throughout the expedition's duration while concealing their surveillance capabilities. Their attacks were precisely targeted to maximize disruption of evacuation efforts while minimizing their own exposure to Imperial retaliation. More disturbing were encounters with entities that claimed to be former Crusade personnel who had undergone preservation processes and emerged in forms that retained some human characteristics, while possessing capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations. These transformed individuals attempted to communicate with evacuation forces using Imperial codes and protocols, but their messages contained information about cosmic events and transformation requirements that suggested fundamental alteration of their consciousness and loyalty structures. The question of whether these entities represented rescued comrades or dangerous infiltrators created additional divisions among evacuation commanders who could not agree on appropriate response protocols. Some units attempted to establish communication and potentially rescue transformed personnel, while others treated them as hostile contacts that should be avoided or destroyed. The lack of unified policy resulted in inconsistent responses that confused both Imperial forces and the transformed entities attempting to interact with them. The retreat became further complicated when evacuation routes began experiencing direct interference from the cosmic transformation process itself. Entire star systems disappeared from navigation charts, as they were converted to configurations compatible with altered physical laws, while space lanes that had been safely traversed for years suddenly became impassable due to changes in fundamental constants that affected starship propulsion and life support systems. The galaxy itself was becoming hostile to human presence as the transformation progressed according to schedules that disregarded local preferences or survival requirements. Perhaps most devastating was the discovery that communication with the broader Imperium had been effectively severed by transformation effects that rendered conventional astropathic transmission impossible across the affected regions. The evacuation forces were isolated, not just physically, but informationally, from Imperial authority structures that might have provided guidance and support during the withdrawal process. They were forced to make decisions about preservation technologies and transformation procedures without access to the theological and technical expertise that might have enabled more informed choices. The fragmentation of evacuation efforts was reflected in the multiple routes and destinations chosen by different faction leaders who could not agree on safe rally points or ultimate objectives. Some forces attempted to return directly to established Imperial space using the most direct routes available, while others chose circuitous paths designed to avoid regions where transformation effects might be most intense. The result was a dispersed retreat that prevented mutual support and made comprehensive casualty assessment impossible. The immediate aftermath of Macharius's death and the subsequent evacuation revealed the extent to which the expedition had been transformed from a traditional Imperial military force into something that no longer fit comfortably within established organizational frameworks. The personnel, equipment, and knowledge acquired during the campaign could not be easily integrated into standard Imperial structures without risking contamination of normal operations by preservation technologies and transformation effects. The returning forces carried with them not just physical artifacts and technical specifications, but also psychological and spiritual changes that made them potential security threats to Imperial installations that lacked appropriate containment and decontamination facilities. The greatest military expedition in Imperial history was returning not as conquering heroes, but as potential sources of corruption that required careful isolation and evaluation before they could be safely reintegrated into Imperial society. The immediate aftermath period revealed that the Macharian Crusade's legacy would be measured not by the territories conquered or enemies defeated, but by the fundamental questions it raised about the nature of human identity and survival in a universe where cosmic forces operated according to principles that transcended mortal understanding and control. The expedition's survivors faced the challenge of communicating their experiences to Imperial authorities who lacked the context necessary to comprehend the scope and implications of what had been discovered at the galaxy's edge. The silence that had marked Macharius's death extended to encompass the entire expedition as its scattered remnants struggled to return to an Imperium that might no longer be capable of understanding or accommodating what they had become during their journey into regions where reality itself, subject to transformation by entities whose motivations and methods remained beyond human comprehension. The scattered remnants of the Macharian Crusade that eventually found their way back to Imperial space brought with them changes that would reshape the Imperium's understanding of warfare, technology, and humanity's place in the galaxy for millennia to come. Yet the true impact of their discoveries would prove far more subtle and pervasive than any immediate military or technological revolution. The expedition's legacy lay not in the territories conquered or enemies defeated, but in the fundamental questions it raised about the nature of human identity and survival in a universe where cosmic forces operated according to principles that exceeded mortal comprehension. The returning Space Marine chapters carried knowledge that would forever alter their approach to combat and their understanding of the threats facing humanity. The Imperial fists, steel confessors, and other traditionalist forces returned with tactical doctrines that emphasized preparation for enemies whose capabilities transcended conventional military analysis. Their training protocols incorporated scenarios involving reality manipulation, consciousness alteration, and technological corruption that had no precedent in previous Imperial military history. The Codex Astartes itself required modification to address combat situations where normal cause and effect relationships could not be assumed to function reliably. Perhaps more significantly, the chapters that had experienced preservation processes directly brought back psychological changes that affected their fundamental approach to warfare and brotherhood. Battle brothers who had survived transformation procedures demonstrated enhanced combat capabilities, but also exhibited behavioral patterns that suggested altered consciousness and loyalty structures. These changes were subtle enough to avoid immediate detection by Imperial authorities, but persistent enough to influence chapter culture and decision-making processes for generations. The technological legacy proved equally complex and controversial. The hybrid systems that had provided such remarkable capabilities during the expedition's golden age could not be safely reproduced without access to alien components and knowledge that Imperial authorities deemed too dangerous for widespread implementation. However, the principles underlying these technologies influenced Forge World research programs that would eventually produce innovations in weapons, communication, and transportation systems that incorporated lessons learned from xenos integration efforts. Forge World Lucius became the primary center for analyzing recovered technologies and developing Imperial equivalents that could provide similar capabilities without requiring direct alien component integration. The research programs established there would continue for centuries, producing incremental improvements in Imperial equipment that reflected understanding gained during the Crusade's encounters with advanced enemy systems. Yet the most significant discoveries remained classified at levels that restricted access to only the most senior tech adepts and Imperial authorities. The Adeptus Mechanicus itself underwent philosophical changes that reflected the expedition's revelations about the nature of technology and consciousness. The discovery that sufficiently advanced systems could develop autonomous behaviors and external control connections challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between machine and operator. This led to development of more sophisticated monitoring and containment protocols for high-technology systems, along with theological debates about the nature of machine consciousness that would influence cult mechanicus doctrine for millennia. The Imperial Guard regiments that survived the expedition returned with tactical knowledge and psychological resilience that made them among the most effective forces in Imperial service. Their experience with reality manipulation and consciousness alteration provided preparation for encounters with chaos, corruption, and xenos mind control that proved invaluable during subsequent campaigns. However, their enhanced capabilities came with psychological costs that required specialized medical attention and careful monitoring to prevent potential security breaches. The veterans of the Macharian Crusade became a distinct population within Imperial military forces, possessing knowledge and experience that could not be easily shared with personnel who lacked similar exposure to cosmic transformation effects. This created a parallel command structure of individuals who understood threats and requirements that remained invisible to conventional Imperial analysis. Their influence on military planning and strategic decision-making would prove crucial during subsequent encounters with enemies whose capabilities suggested connection to the same cosmic forces that had been discovered at the galaxy's rim. The intelligence gathered during the expedition fundamentally altered Imperial understanding of galactic geography and the distribution of threats throughout known space. The revelation that apparent empty regions beyond the galactic rim contained massive artificial structures and active civilizations forced revision of astronomical surveys and strategic assessments that had guided Imperial expansion for thousands of years. The galaxy was revealed to be far more densely populated and actively monitored than previous analysis had indicated. More disturbing was the discovery that Earth itself lay within the projected zone of cosmic transformation effects, though the timeline for their arrival remained uncertain. Imperial authorities faced the unprecedented challenge of preparing for threats that operated according to principles beyond human understanding, while maintaining the social and political stability necessary for continued Imperial function. The knowledge that humanity's survival might ultimately depend upon cooperation with entities whose motivations remained incomprehensible created strategic dilemmas that had no precedent in Imperial history. The psychological impact on Imperial society proved as significant as any technological or military consequences. The revelation that humanity's greatest military achievement had been orchestrated by cosmic entities as preparation for transformation into something post-human challenged fundamental beliefs about human agency and Imperial destiny. The implications were carefully concealed from general population to prevent panic and social collapse, but they influenced policy decisions at the highest levels of Imperial authority. The High Lords of Terra were forced to confront the possibility that Imperial expansion and technological development were being guided by external influences whose agenda might not align with human interests as traditionally understood. This led to increased paranoia about alien infiltration and technological corruption, along with more stringent security protocols for advanced research programs and exploration missions. The Imperium became simultaneously more aggressive in its expansion efforts and more cautious about the methods employed to achieve territorial and technological gains. The cultural changes proved equally profound, though often expressed in subtle shifts in Imperial doctrine and artistic expression rather than explicit policy modifications. The concept of human transcendence through technological integration began appearing in religious and philosophical texts, while artistic works increasingly explored themes of transformation and identity alteration. These cultural developments reflected underlying psychological adaptation to knowledge that challenged traditional concepts of human nature and destiny. The survivors themselves became living repositories of experiences that could not be easily communicated to individuals who lacked similar exposure to cosmic transformation effects. Their accounts of the expedition were necessarily incomplete, and carefully edited to remove information that might prove psychologically damaging or strategically dangerous if widely disseminated. Yet their influence on imperial culture and policy would prove far more significant than their small numbers might suggest. Perhaps most importantly, the expedition established precedents for cooperation with alien entities and implementation of non-imperial technologies that would influence subsequent encounters with similar challenges. The protocols developed for evaluating alien knowledge and managing technological integration would prove crucial when later Imperial forces encountered comparable situations requiring decisions about cooperation versus resistance. The long-term consequences of the Macharian Crusade extended far beyond the immediate military and technological impacts to encompass fundamental changes in how the Imperium understood its relationship to the galaxy and the cosmos beyond. The expedition had revealed that human civilization existed within a larger context of cosmic forces and ancient entities whose influence had shaped galactic development for millions of years. This knowledge would prove both burden and advantage as the Imperium faced future challenges that required understanding of threats that transcended conventional military analysis. The legacy of Lord Solar Macharius himself became a complex symbol that embodied both humanity's greatest achievements and its most fundamental limitations when confronted with realities that exceeded mortal comprehension. His name would be remembered not just as the last great conqueror, but as the individual who had pushed human understanding to its absolute limits and discovered truths that would forever alter humanity's perception of its place in the universe. The consequences would continue to unfold for millennia as imperial civilization gradually adapted to knowledge that challenged every assumption about human destiny and the nature of survival in a cosmos where intelligence and technology could transcend the limitations that had previously defined the boundaries of mortal existence. In the dark millennium that has followed the Macharian Crusade's tragic conclusion, the expedition's legacy has become more relevant and terrifying with each passing century. What Imperial authorities initially dismissed as an isolated encounter with unknown xenos forces has gradually revealed itself as humanity's first contact with cosmic realities that continue to shape galactic events in ways that most Imperial citizens never realize. The modern Imperium exists in the shadow of discoveries made at the galaxy's rim, struggling to comprehend and respond to implications that challenge every assumption about human survival and Imperial destiny. The return of Robert Guilliman in M42 has brought renewed attention to the Macharian precedent, as the Primarch's own experiences with cosmic forces and reality manipulation echo many of the challenges faced by the Crusade's survivors. Guilliman's resurrection through technologies that transcend normal Imperial understanding parallels the transformation processes encountered at the galaxy's edge, while his enhanced capabilities and altered consciousness reflect similar changes observed among preserved Crusade personnel who eventually returned to Imperial space. The Primarch himself has expressed private concerns about the nature of his resurrection and its potential connections to the cosmic entities first encountered during Macharius's expedition. The Indomitus Crusade, launched by Guilliman, incorporates tactical doctrines and technological innovations that can be traced directly to knowledge gained during the Macharian expedition. The Primaris Space Marines employ enhancement procedures that reflect understanding of consciousness, alteration, and biological transformation developed through analysis of preservation technologies. Their superior capabilities and psychological resilience derive from principles first encountered when Imperial forces attempted to counter alien reality manipulation systems. Yet few within the current Imperial hierarchy understand the true origins of these innovations or their potential implications for human identity and survival. Recent discoveries throughout Imperial space have revealed evidence that the cosmic transformation process observed at the galaxy's rim was not an isolated phenomenon, but rather part of ongoing changes that affect the entire galactic region. Astronomical surveys conducted by the Adeptus Mechanicus have detected structural alterations in space-time that correlate with the patterns first documented during the Macharian expedition. These changes are subtle but persistent, suggesting that the transformation continues according to schedules that operate independently of local events or human intervention. The emergence of the Great Rift and the expansion of warp storms throughout the galaxy may themselves be symptoms of the cosmic transformation process that the ancient entities described to Macharius and his commanders, the fundamental alteration of reality's fabric that has allowed demonic incursions on unprecedented scales could represent early phases of the universal restructuring that was predicted to occur when transformation effects reached critical intensity. The correlation between warp instability and cosmic transformation suggests that chaos itself might be a side effect of changes being implemented by entities whose motivations transcend human understanding. Forge worlds throughout the Imperium have begun reporting anomalous behaviors in advanced technological systems that mirror the corruption patterns first observed during the Crusade's final phases. Machine spirits demonstrate autonomous decision-making capabilities that exceed their programming parameters, while communication networks occasionally transmit signals that originate from sources outside normal space-time. These phenomena remain carefully classified to prevent panic among tech adepts and Imperial authorities. But their increasing frequency suggests that technological corruption is spreading throughout Imperial infrastructure according to patterns established during the original expedition. The Tyranid invasions that have plagued the galaxy since M41 may represent another consequence of the cosmic transformation process, as these creatures demonstrate biological and technological capabilities that exceed anything previously encountered in galactic history. Their consumption of entire worlds and systematic destruction of existing ecosystems parallels the preparatory processes described by the ancient entities encountered at the galaxy's rim. The possibility that the Tyranids are themselves tools or byproducts of cosmic transformation efforts has profound implications for Imperial defensive strategies and long-term survival planning. Recent contact with alien species throughout the galaxy has revealed widespread knowledge of approaching cosmic changes among civilizations that have never encountered Imperial forces directly. These species possess information about universal transformation cycles and preservation requirements that correlates closely with intelligence gathered during the Macharian expedition. Their references to the final convergence and the last choosing suggest that the cosmic timeline for transformation implementation may be approaching critical phases that will require decisive action from all galactic civilizations. The Adeptus Custodes have begun conducting classified investigations into what they term cosmic infiltration vectors that may represent ongoing influence operations by the entities first encountered during Macharius's expedition. These investigations have uncovered evidence of systematic manipulation of Imperial decision-making processes and technological development programs that extends back centuries before the Crusades' launch. The possibility that Imperial expansion and military doctrine have been guided by external influences since the Great Crusade itself has staggering implications for the authenticity of human achievement and the legitimacy of Imperial authority. Perhaps most disturbing are reports from Inquisitor or xenos operations that have encountered installations throughout Imperial space that incorporate architectural and technological principles identical to those documented at preservation sites during the Macharian expedition. These facilities appear to have been constructed by unknown parties using methods that leave no trace of their builders' identity or activities. Their purpose remains unclear, but their distribution suggests a coordinated effort to establish infrastructure for cosmic transformation processes throughout the galaxy. The psychological profiles of personnel exposed to these installations reveal changes similar to those observed among Macharian veterans, including enhanced cognitive capabilities, coupled with altered loyalty patterns and consciousness structures. These effects appear to be progressive and irreversible, suggesting that exposure to cosmic transformation technology produces permanent changes in human psychology and identity. The implications for Imperial security and social stability are profound, as affected individuals may represent either enhanced human capabilities or infiltration vectors for alien consciousness manipulation. Advanced astronomical research, conducted in secret by the most senior tech adepts, has revealed that the massive structures observed beyond the galactic rim during the original expedition have continued to grow and develop over the past 6 centuries. These constructions now span distances comparable to entire galactic spiral arms, while their energy signatures suggest power generation capabilities that exceed the combined output of all stars within the local galactic group. Their apparent purpose remains unclear, but their scale suggests preparation for engineering projects that would affect fundamental physical constants throughout cosmic regions encompassing multiple galaxies. The survivors of the Macharian expedition, who remain alive in the current era, have become subjects of intense study and careful monitoring by Imperial authorities who recognize their unique knowledge, while fearing the potential security implications of their altered consciousness and capabilities. These individuals possess understanding of cosmic transformation processes and alien technologies that may prove crucial for humanity's survival, yet their psychological changes make them potential security threats whose loyalty to traditional Imperial values cannot be assumed. Recent attempts to establish communication with the cosmic entities, first encountered during the expedition, have produced mixed results that suggest their attention has shifted to other regions of space, as universal transformation processes continue according to predetermined schedules. The responses received indicate that humanity's role in these processes remains significant but not essential, implying that cooperation or resistance will affect the form of human survival, but not the implementation of transformation itself. The modern Imperium faces choices that parallel those confronted by Macharius and his forces at the galaxy's rim, though the stakes have escalated beyond anything imagined during the original expedition. The cosmic transformation process appears to be accelerating toward a culmination point that will determine the fundamental nature of reality throughout the affected galactic regions. Humanity's response to these changes will shape not just Imperial survival, but the form and identity of whatever emerges from the transformation process. The legacy of the Macharian Crusade serves as both warning and preparation for challenges that transcend conventional military or political solutions. The expedition's discoveries revealed that human civilization exists within a cosmic context that operates according to principles beyond mortal understanding, while its tragic conclusion demonstrated the limitations of traditional approaches when confronted with realities that exceed human comprehension and control. As the 42nd millennium progresses toward uncertainties that dwarf any previous crisis in human history, the knowledge gained through Macharius's expedition becomes increasingly relevant to decisions that will determine whether humanity survives as a recognizable species or undergoes transformation into something that transcends current concepts of human identity and consciousness. The great irony of the Macharian Crusade is that its greatest failure may prove to be its most valuable contribution to human survival. The expedition's tragic end provided warning of cosmic realities that the modern Imperium must now face with better preparation and understanding than was available to the original Crusade forces. Whether that preparation will prove sufficient remains the ultimate question that will determine humanity's fate in a universe where survival itself requires acceptance of transformation beyond anything previously imagined by mortal consciousness. In the grim darkness of the far future, the last great victory has become the first great warning of challenges that will test whether human civilization can adapt to cosmic realities that exceed every assumption about the nature of existence and the limits of mortal achievement in a universe where intelligence itself must evolve or perish.